Chapter 22 of Making Fate by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. An Evening of Decisions. Marjorie started nervously. "It seems late for the bell to ring," she said. "How late is it?" "The clock struck 11 not long ago." As Mr. Maxwell spoke, he drew a match from his pocket and lighted the hall gas. Then he stepped forward to the door, Marjorie waiting under the gaslight to learn what could be wanted. She remembered for a long time just what a strange sensation it gave her when the locked and bolted door was finally unfastened and thrown open, revealing Ralph Bramlett. He uttered a single exclamation, which might have expressed only surprise. She could not afterwards recall what it was. As for her surprise was so great that she stood quite still and waited. But his errand was prosaic enough. He had reached home a short time before to find his mother quite ill and needing a woman's care, and his sister was out of town. Could Mrs. Edmonds give him the address of Nurse Crawford, who used to be in their family, and of whom they had lost sight? His mother thought that Mrs. Edmonds would know just where to find her. "Yes," said Marjorie, coming out of her bewilderment and speaking quickly. "Mamma will know about her. She was here only a few days ago. I will ask Mamma." And she sped up the stairs. "Come in," said Mr. Maxwell hospitably. "Will you have a seat while you wait? Mrs. Edmonds has retired, I believe. There may be a few minutes' delay. I hope your mother is not seriously ill?" But he need not have tried to be sociable. The young man was in no mood for sociability. His attempt at reply was hardly civil, and Mr. Maxwell, feeling that words from him were evidently not wanted, stood silently by until Marjorie was seen coming downstairs. Then he went back to the library, closing the door after him. He need not have done so. Ralph Bramlett had no civil words even for Marjorie just then. In her heart was a kind, grave sympathy for him. It seemed as though he must have heard it in her voice. "Mamma says that Nurse Crawford is at the corner of Bond and Adams streets. That boarding house, you know. She is not engaged anywhere, and will be sure to go with you. Oh, Ralph, I hope your mother is not very ill. Mamma wants to know if she can be of any assistance. She would be glad to come at once if she may. Mr. Maxwell will take her over there, I am sure." "No," said Ralph sharply. "She will not be wanted. Mother is not alarmingly ill. She simply needs care. I am sorry to have had to trouble you. I did not think of anybody else who would be likely to know about Nurse Crawford." Then he had turned and left her standing in the doorway. When he reached the first corner, he looked back and Marjorie had disappeared. Mr. Maxwell stood in the doorway alone. He muttered something again, not complimentary to that gentleman, and dashed around the corner at full speed. Marjorie went slowly back upstairs, Mr. Maxwell having assured her that he would make all fastenings secure. For a few weeks past she had occasionally occupied herself with surmisings as to when they would meet face to face, she and Ralph, and be compelled to speak to each other. Of course the time would come. They could not go on in this way through the years, nor through the winter. Even in church they might meet occasionally, though the Bramlett pew was on the other side of the church from them, and for weeks they had successfully avoided each other. For that matter, Ralph had not been very regular in his attendance at church. But of course there must come a change. How would it come? How would he treat her? Did he mean not to know her any more? In that note he had called her Miss Edmonds. Must she say Mr. Bramlett? Could she train her lips to form those words? She had called him so in jest sometimes when they were young together. How long ago it seemed. She had tried various titles to see which would sound the best. Dr. Bramlett, Judge Bramlett, and the like, always returning to that word judge, and assuring him that that was the one which fitted his name and face. She thought she might in time learn to call him that. It did not sound so utterly strange as Mr. Bramlett. Now they had met once more, but what a strange meeting! "Oh, Ralph," she had said, without thinking, under the fear that his mother was seriously ill, but he had repulsed her. He would not have even her sympathy. He had called her nothing, but had rushed away as rapidly as he could, seeming to be almost angry with her. It was very strange. She had now no feeling of anger in her heart toward him. She could almost have said to him, "Oh, Ralph, don't treat me so. Let us be friends. If you cannot care for me any more, never mind. If you like Estelle instead of me, why, you cannot help that. I forgive you, but let us be friends." No, she would not have said those words, of course, because he might have misunderstood them. But she could feel them. Mrs. Edmonds's door opened as her daughter came up the stairs. She was hastily dressing. "What does he say, Marjorie? Does he want me to come?" "No, mamma, he said there was no need. He does not think his mother is seriously ill, but she needs care, and Hannah is away. He went at once for Nurse Crawford. She is at home, I saw her tonight as we passed, so it will be all right. What a pity it is that I disturbed you. If I had only thought a moment, I might have told him where to find Nurse Crawford without coming to you." "Daughter, I do not understand. Did you answer the bell? And have you been up all this time? How came you to go down, dear, alone? I do not like to have you answering bells at this time of night." "I did not, mother. Mr. Maxwell was in the back parlour, studying those old books, and he went to the door. I was downstairs too, so I saw Ralph as soon as the door was opened." Was that sufficient explanation? Her mother regarded her curiously, somewhat anxiously. Were there always to be secrets between her daughter and herself? The communicating door was still closed. She had noticed it with a sigh, when she dropped asleep, after waiting long, it seemed to her. The anxious look in her eyes went to Marjorie's heart. She wanted to be very tender of her mother. "It is not late, Mothery," she said, using the pet name which the mother had not heard for several weeks. "It could not have been much after 10 when I went downstairs. I was in search of an old book of ours, hoping that it would give me some help in a line where I greatly needed it. But I found Mr. Maxwell among the books, and he gave me just the help I was searching for. Mothery, I wanted to know how to give myself away forever into the keeping of Jesus Christ, and he told me how. That will make you glad, will it not?" Will Marjorie ever have sweeter kisses than those with which her mother covered cheeks and lips? Will her head be ever drawn to a tenderer human resting place than the mother's breast afforded? Glad! Mrs. Edmonds, quiet, reserved woman that she was, could have shouted for joy. She knew it meant so much, this surrender of her daughter's. By nature timid and shrinking, she had, by turns, admired, and stood appalled, before the indomitable energy and persistence of her child, and wondered whereunto such power would lead her. But now that she had accepted a leader, the mother could feel how surely she would follow him, and of what value her strength of will would be in his service. Then at last Marjorie turned the key in her own door, and was alone once more on this eventful night. She went and stood before her dressing bureau, and looked at herself deliberately in the mirror. Had any outward change taken place in her appearance? Of course there had not, and she smiled at her childishness, but a strange restfulness had certainly come into her heart. She felt as though her feet rested at last on firm ground. She realized that a matter of infinite importance had been settled since she last stood there. Whatever came to her in the near or distant future, nothing could unsettle the security of her present foothold. Life had taken on a new and solemn meaning. It was serious business, it was true, to live, but it was also dignified business, worthy of an immortal soul's best efforts. Hitherto she had played at life. Now she would begin to live in earnest. It was not until the gas had been turned out for the night, and the communicating door had been set wide open, and Marjorie's head was resting on her pillow, that she remembered that her handkerchief was still in Mr. Maxwell's possession. It would perhaps be hard to imagine a greater contrast than Ralph Bramlett's New Year's evening presented to this one of Marjorie's. It will be remembered that he was a man of moods, and the great barometer in the office where he toiled could not have indicated changes of temperature more rapidly than his mental moods changed front. Very recently he had determined within himself that it was high time to end this farce. He had punished Marjorie, and for that matter himself too, quite enough. Probably the reason why she did not write to him, as he had fully expected her to do, was because her immaculate mother did not approve of it. He would call upon her, formally enough, as he might on any passing acquaintance, but her way of receiving the call should guide him as to his next step. In his secret heart he believed that there would be no difficulty about that next step. There were moments when he felt quite certain that Marjorie's reception of his advances would be all that he could desire. Then he heard that the Edmonds home would depart from its time-honored custom and not open its doors to New Year's callers. For a few minutes he was annoyed. In the next few he had decided that this was so much in his favor. He was not supposed to know that the house was not open as usual. He would ring their bell, and if the little maid, who was in the habit of serving them on special days, responded, he would tell her that he was too old a friend to stand on ceremony, and bid her take his card to Miss Marjorie. This, he told himself, would be a stroke of genius. If Marjorie once got his card in her possession, he felt sure of the rest, and they would not be annoyed by callers. If Mrs. Edmonds should answer the bell herself, he would be as dignified as she could possibly be, but he would inform her that he wished to see Miss Marjorie on important business. "She will hardly deny me the house," he said, waxing indignant over her possible coldness. It will have to be admitted, in passing, that he also prepared for another possibility by muttering to himself that if that puppy of a Maxwell came to the door, he would kick him down the steps. To one of Ralph Bramlett's temperament, having carried out his intentions mentally to such perfection, even having arranged a program of the conversation according to his favorite method, imagine what it was to have his plans completely overturned by seeing Marjorie drive gaily by, not only seated beside Mr. Maxwell, but actually driving his handsome horses for him. It was characteristic of the type of young men to which he belonged that he took jealous thought, even then, to the fact that the horses were finer than any which he had to drive. After that, imagine the torture which he must have endured for the next hour, in listening to Estelle Douglas's eager information, having first committed himself before her in a way which he could not but feel would make his future with Marjorie more difficult still. Having returned Estelle to her place in the McAllister parlours, this much abused man gave himself up to gloom for the next few hours, evolving only this out of the chaos of his thoughts, that he would find out if possible just how far Marjorie's intimacy with her mother's lodger had progressed. The person who could tell him a great deal, he was convinced, was Estelle Douglas. With this thought in view, he called upon her as early in the evening as he could hope to find her at home, and very soon began what he thought was a skillful method of questioning to secure all the information which she possessed. Unfortunately for his peace of mind, Estelle believed that she possessed a great deal. Glyde's innocent remarks concerning Mr. Maxwell's reading aloud in the Edmonds parlour, her accounts of their plans for New Year's Day, and above all, the eager story which she had to tell that evening, had furnished her far-seeing sister with much material. In truth, her translation of certain remarks of Marjorie's and of Mr. Maxwell's would not have been recognized by themselves. Not that Estelle meant to falsify, or had an idea that she was really doing so. She possessed a vivid imagination, and wanted to believe in the theory which she had built up out of her meagre facts. She was successful to the degree that she convinced Ralph Bramlett that Marjorie had been, what he chose to call, playing a part with him. He jumped immediately to the wildest conclusions, made himself believe that even at the time she had written that last note to him, she was receiving Mr. Maxwell's special attentions. Nay, it was entirely possible that there had been an understanding between them on that very night in which she had walked away from the Schuyler farm in a supposed burst of indignation. Was it probable that she would have started off on a 7 miles walk at that time of night, if she had not been reasonably sure of being met and taken care of? It astonished and disgusted him that he had not thought of this before. It was all very plain now, he told himself. From first to last he had been made a fool of. Marjorie had pretended to be devoted to him at the very time when she was using him as a foil, the better to show off her perfections to Mr. Maxwell. How he could have concocted such an absurd theory as that out of any material with which he had to build, cannot be explained by any laws based on reason and common sense. It must simply be remembered that he was a man of extremes, that he paid, when he was in a certain humour, the least possible attention to the dictates of common sense, and that the whim of the passing moment governed him to an alarming degree. Left to himself, he might have concluded by the next day that he had been unnecessarily hasty, and that Marjorie had been simply treating Mr. Maxwell as he had Estelle Douglas, entertaining herself during the period of coldness between them. In the course of the next 36 hours he would almost certainly have gotten back to his complacent frame of mind, and been ready to plan again for that interrupted call. But he was not left to himself. Estelle took care to plan that she should not be interrupted by other callers, and as her sister Fanny was not at home, she and Ralph had the evening together. "So you think they are really engaged?" He tried to ask the question carelessly, interrupting some remark of hers to do it. "Why, I think they must be, of course. How else is such exceeding familiarity to be accounted for? To judge from Glyde's reports, they have gotten so far that they put all ceremony aside and treat each other like people who have had an understanding for ever so long. It isn't like Marjorie, you know, unless there is an engagement. I always thought her a very reticent person. Oh, I wouldn't have had such an idea if you had not told me this afternoon that there was nothing whatever between you and her, and had never been, save a boy and girl friendship. I confess that I have not understood it, and that I have been distressed both for Marjorie and for you. But the moment you told me that, and I realized that you and she had simply been like brother and sister all these years, it threw a new light upon everything. I hope it will be all right with Marjorie. He seems very much of a stranger. They really do not know anything about him, of course, except what he says of himself. But he is wealthy, I have heard, and Marjorie likes money. At least, she likes the luxuries which money will produce, and she is fond of position, too. He is an author, you know, and a college professor besides, one who has been given a year's vacation to enable him to complete the preparation of some stupid book. Textbook, I think. It must be a dreadful bore to have to do all the time with such an extremely literary man. But I presume that is what fascinated Marjorie at first. She is a little bit inclined to be aristocratic in her tastes. I have always known that. Mrs. Edmonds is not wealthy, it is true, but she belongs to a very old family, and Marjorie was always disposed, I think, to look down a little on people who had to earn their living in ways which did not happen to suit her taste." Ralph was turning over piles of music while Estelle was saying this, supposed to be hunting for a song which she had asked him to sing with her. He bent lower over the music rack, in the hope that she might not see the dark flush which overspread his face at those words. He felt that he understood her only too well. What could she mean but that Marjorie had looked down upon him because he was earning his living as a bookkeeper instead of being a law student, as he knew she had wished him to be? Well, let her go. After all these years of intimacy with him, if she had been fascinated by a stranger because he could write books and had a title or two after his name, she was not worthy of an honest man's love. He would have nothing more to do with her. He found the music at last, and they sang the song, Estelle remarking cheerfully at its close, "Our voices sound well together, I think. What a pity we haven't an audience. Suppose we were to go around giving parlor concerts. We might make a good deal of money. We would look very well together, too. We are of about the right size. We could take Glide along to play the accompaniments. Wouldn't that be an original way to raise funds?" She laughed gaily as she spoke, and was talking the merest nonsense, of course. But Ralph replied gravely, "We would look reasonably well together perhaps under any circumstances. I do not know but you and I are fairly well suited to each other. How would it do to enter into partnership on other lines than concert giving?" He spoke under impulse, of course. When did this young man speak in any other way? He hardly realized the import of what he was saying. The strongest feeling of which he was conscious at that moment was a desire to show Marjorie Edmonds in some way that he was by no means broken-hearted over her, nor did he lack for intimate companionship because she had played him false. He was, possibly, unprepared for the deep womanly flush on Estelle's face, and the light in her eyes. He was certainly unprepared for the warmth of her reply. He went home very early that evening, much earlier than Estelle thought desirable, and he told himself moodily, as he walked away, that he had gotten himself into trouble now. Why had he been such an idiot as to speak out his passing thoughts? At home he had found the state of affairs which has been explained, and had hurried back to town, glad of any excuse which would oblige him to call at the Edmonds home. On the way he speculated as to what might result from this call. Suppose he should happen to see Marjorie? He could hardly ask for her at so late an hour, but she might be there, and they might have a few minutes' talk together. And a very few minutes might perhaps right all wrongs. Yes, he forgot Estelle Douglas entirely, and the words he had spoken to her. That mood had passed. He was in a reverent one now, and called his mother's illness a special interposition of Providence in his behalf. When he rang the bell, he had planned the words which he would speak to Marjorie, feeling sure that he would see her. Would not Providence take care of that? And he had seen her standing there under the gas jet, with a strange light on her face, such as he by no means understood. The language of the country whence it was born was utterly unfamiliar to him. Of course he misunderstood the situation. Of course Marjorie and Mr. Maxwell had been spending the evening together, and were taking leave of each other probably, when he interrupted them. It was her feeling for him which could put such a light into the girl's eyes. The thought made him angry, so bitterly angry that he could hardly treat her with the outward courtesy which decency demanded. As he rushed away into the night, he thought again of Estelle, and told himself that it was just as well that he had spoken to her as he did. She cared for him at least, and it was more than Marjorie had ever done. There wasn't any such thing as real disinterested love in the world. He had proved it. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Making Fate by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. Principles and Professions. In due course of time, the first Sabbath in the new year arrived, and Ralph Bramlett succeeded in creating fully as much of a sensation as he had planned. His mother was better, but too ill to think of attending church. This being the case, he had magnanimously decided to tell her of his intentions that Sabbath morning. He had been touched by her way of receiving the news. She was a shy, quiet mother, always dominated by her children, especially by her son. But she had kissed him, a thing she had not seemed to find an opportunity to do since he had considered himself a man, and shed a few tears over him, as she told him that he was her dear boy, that she had always known he would be a comfort to her, and that she had long looked forward in the hope of such a day. If she could only be in church to see him received, her bliss would be complete. He had returned the kiss warmly, and assured her that he meant to be a comfort to her always, in the future as in the past, and had gone away feeling that he was a good son in every way, that there were not many like him. As they were driving to church, Ralph bethought himself that it might be better to explain matters to his father, lest the surprise be too great for him. Mr. Bramlett was not a professing Christian, but his son had no hesitancy in talking about such topics with him, and felt at no loss for the proper words. "By the way, father," he said, just as his father had concluded a sentence about the unusually mild weather they were having for that time of year, "I am to unite with the church today. I thought I would perhaps better mention it, lest you might be taken by surprise." "Well," said Mr. Bramlett, the single word bristling with surprise, "I certainly am astonished. I hadn't thought of such a thing. When did you decide that? It is a sudden move on your part, isn't it?" "Not particularly so, sir. My mind was made up some days ago." "Well," said Mr. Bramlett again, after a thoughtful silence, "I suppose I am glad to hear it. I ought to be. I respect that sort of thing when it is genuine. I hope you know what you are about, and mean it." "I generally know what I am about, I believe," said Ralph with dignity. "Yes, you think you do, I am sure. What I mean is, that it would be a serious matter to make any mistakes in this line. It always seemed to me to be a very important thing, this making a profession of religion. I know a good many people who don't appear to do anything but profess it. But there is a genuine kind, and I have seen it. I wouldn't want any other kind myself." "I don't think I understand you, sir. I trust you do not mean to intimate that I am not earnest in this matter, that my kind isn't genuine?" "Oh, no, of course not. I didn't mean anything special. I was only trying to put you on your guard. Young people sometimes enter into that sort of thing thoughtlessly, I think. Though you are not one of the thoughtless sort exactly either. Well, I hope you will be glad of it." Silence for a few minutes, then Mr. Bramlett spoke again. "You will be getting out of your present business pretty soon, won't you?" "I don't know why, I am sure." The son spoke testily. "What has my present business to do with it? I am giving entire satisfaction, I believe, to my employers, and I am earning more money than has been earned in a single day on the farm since I have known it. Why should I undertake to make a change, at least in these hard times?" "Oh, I don't know. You know what I think about these things, Ralph. I am not a professor of religion myself, but as a man I have my views. You know I have never looked with satisfaction on this business of yours. There is something to be considered besides money. It didn't seem to me that it belonged to a religious profession to have to do with a distillery." "If you will excuse the expression, sir, I must say that I consider that utter nonsense. I have no more to do with the distillery than you have. I suppose I would abolish it to-morrow if I had the power. I am certainly just as much of a temperance man as I ever was in my life. But why not look at these things from a common-sense standpoint instead of as children? The distillery is in existence, and its bookkeeping has to be done by somebody. Why in the world shouldn't I do it, and get the salary which they are willing to pay for it? There is neither more nor less liquor made because I am keeping the books. I look at that from a purely business point of view. As matters stand with us, I cannot afford to throw away a $1,500 salary for the sake of sentiment." "Is it mere sentiment, Ralph? Suppose the business were the making of counterfeit money." His son gave an irritable twist to his shoulders, and prefaced his reply by a contemptuous exclamation which is beyond the scope of orthography. He did not believe that his father's strength consisted in argument. "That strikes me as an exceedingly irrelevant remark, as far from referring to a parallel case as possible. The making of counterfeit money is against the law. The business in which the Snyders are engaged is sustained by the laws of the land, and they occupy an exceedingly respectable position in the world. If I ever reach as prominent a place as any member of that firm holds in the world's opinion, I shall have cause to be thankful. It does not seem to be necessary for us to discuss these matters any further, father. My mind is quite made up, and my conscience is entirely at ease. Meantime, the family, you will remember, is profiting by my decision. It would not have been possible for me to have surrounded my mother with as many comforts as I have since she has taken ill, if it had not been for the salary which it seems to be orthodox to despise." If his aim was to silence his father, he succeeded. Mr. Bramlett was not at any time a man of many words. The day was beautiful, and the large church was well filled. Those who were not regular in their attendance at any other time made an effort to get out to the first communion service of the year, that time which seems to be almost weighed down with the good and weak resolutions of the careless and ill at ease. A larger number than usual of those who were not communicants were present. It had in some way gotten abroad among the young people of their circle that Ralph Bramlett was on that day to be received into the church. In short, nearly everything connected with this new departure of his had worked according to his mind. Dr. Ford, upon being notified of the young man's intentions, had expressed his unbounded gratification thereat, and had taken the deepest interest in the whole matter. Among other questions asked had come this: "Do you care to tell me what led you to a consideration of this subject? Or rather, what led you to make the final decision?" Over this Ralph had reflected thoughtfully for a few moments, and then had replied that he supposed he might say that he had brought himself to the decision. The question had presented itself to him one night, not only as eminently practical, but as one which a reasonable person ought to decide without further delay, and he had accordingly done so. This reply seemed to impress his pastor exceedingly. He repeated it to the examining committee, and remarked that it was an illustration of the power of a cultivated conscience, and an encouraging reminder of the fact that the truth was working in quiet ways of which they knew nothing. He went home greatly encouraged, and told his wife that young Bramlett was a rather unusual young man. Truly he should think a man of decision and of action. Such a person ought to be a power among young men especially. He looked to see results from the stand which had been taken that day. His wife said, "Bramlett! There is but one young man in the Bramlett family, is there? He must be the one who has accepted a clerkship in that great distillery where the Snyders make their money. A rather strange position for one to take who was contemplating uniting with the church, was it not?" "Yes," said the minister thoughtfully. "I suppose this decision came afterwards. I had forgotten that he was employed there. Of course, he is only a bookkeeper, but then, if he were my son, I shouldn't like it. He will probably make a change as soon as he can. Some things are queer, my dear. Perhaps we should not expect too much of young men who have to earn their own living. I learned the other day that our Mr. Bemis, who has been a member of this church for at least 30 years, is the probable owner not only of that large hotel on the corner of Bond and Belmont streets, but of the cafe and saloon connected with it on the other corner." "Is it possible?" said Mrs. Ford. "Still, an owner seems a little different, doesn't it? He doesn't run the hotel." "No, he only leases it for a very large sum, and pockets the money. Some of it he puts into our church. Quite a good deal, indeed. He is benevolently inclined, you know. The hotel is chiefly famous for the choice wines and liquors which it furnishes its guests. What can we look for from the Ralph Bramletts of the world when the church sets them such brilliant examples?" He sighed as he spoke. He was a young minister, and had not been long in this pastorate, and every day gave him some fresh item to consider. There were times when he could not but feel that the problems of life were thickening around him. Oh, for young, strong men to lean upon and to lead into the thick of the conflict! Would Ralph Bramlett prove such an one? The examining committee had decided that his examination was eminently satisfactory. So was his public reception. It was, as he had supposed it would be, more marked because of his coming entirely alone. One or two of the brethren had commented on that. They said it showed independence of character and a strong conviction of his duty. It cannot be denied that, as the young man stood before the altar, listening to and giving grave assent to the articles of faith which that church held, he looked in all respects the model. More than one mother thought so, and sighed, and wished that their sons could have stood beside him. Some of them thought that his mother ought to have been there to see. They gathered about him after service, old friends and many new ones, and shook hands and congratulated him and themselves. Some of them spoke earnest words of advice, old men in the church, who held his hand in a firm grasp as they did so. And he bent his head toward them and listened with deference, and honestly meant to profit by their words, and looked handsome and distinguished, and could not forget that he did. When he had first planned this entire scene, it was Mrs. Edmonds and her daughter whom he had especially meant to impress. He hardly knew what he had expected from them. It happened that their seat was across the church from the one that he occupied, as far removed from his indeed as space would permit, and during the period of their estrangement, it had not seemed strange that they had not even exchanged bows on Sundays. But on this day it was all to be different. He had meant to put himself directly in their way. Once he had planned to hold out his hand to Mrs. Edmonds and gravely and magnanimously forgive her for all the supposed evil which she had done him. On New Year's Day he had almost decided not to make that proposed call in order to have the excitement of the first meeting on that eventful Sabbath. Finding himself not willing to wait for this, he had compromised. If Marjorie should happen not to be at home, then he would wait until Sunday, and looking at her with grave, reproachful eyes as he held out his hand to her, would say, "May I walk with you a little way, as we used to do in the old times?" But all these plans had been utterly and hopelessly destroyed. He was a person of consideration, but the ones for whom he had planned cared nothing about it. He met them in the aisle, it is true. He had been determined that he would, and bestowed upon Mrs. Edmonds the most dignified of bows, keeping its counterpart for Marjorie. Then, at just the right moment, when it would be impossible for her not to hear, he had said to the young lady in front of her, "Estelle, wait for me a moment, please. I must speak with old Mr. Crawford." He had put an air of quiet command into his tone, as one who had the right to direct her movements, and Estelle's expressive face had responded delightfully to his power. Did Marjorie understand? It was the only thing he could think of to show her that he was not crushed. Poor Ralph! If his aim had been to astonish Marjorie, it is almost a pity that he could not have known how thoroughly he had accomplished it. It happened that she had not heard of his intention until his name was announced in the church. One who was watching her might have noticed that as she caught the name, the blood rolled in waves over her face, and then as quickly receded, leaving her very pale. Indeed, her surprise amounted almost to dismay. Her own decision in regard to this matter had been so very recent, and her experience so brief, that the thought of recognition by the visible church had not even as yet occurred to her. Almost immediately, however, she had thought of Ralph, had recalled what Glyde had said about her influencing him, and had wondered in what ways she could bring that influence to bear upon him even now, so that he might be won for Christ. All those first days of her Christian life this may have been said to have been her study, a brave and loyal study. Every thought of influence which she had planned to bring to bear upon him, she had resolved must come through Estelle Douglas. She must reach and influence her. Estelle was a church member, and could therefore be approached on the subject with some hope, at least, that she would be interested. And if she could be led to feel as Glyde did, for instance, of course her thought and prayer would be for Ralph. Such was Marjorie's plan, and she had prayed long about it that morning. A peculiar prayer, chiefly a cry to this newly found powerful friend of hers to take from her heart the feeling of aversion for Estelle Douglas which had grown upon her of late, and help her to love her and be intimate with her, and to try in all wise, kind ways to help her Christward. She prayed that she might do this for her sake, and not alone for Ralph Bramlett's. Coming from such a prayer, it struck her strangely, almost bewilderingly, that this young man for whose soul she had wrestled was far ahead of her, was actually being received that day into the church, and she had not known that he had ever given this subject a serious thought. Strangely enough, this seemed to remove him still farther from her. If he had, during their estrangement, passed through the experience which had just come to her, without a thought of her in it all, with no desire to help her, then indeed he must have gotten very far away from the old friendship. Once more she asked herself the sorrowful question why he could not in it all have acted like a friend. She thought about it sorrowfully during the walk home, while her mother and Mr. Maxwell talked together. How strange it all was! Such a little time ago that she and Ralph had gone, that November morning, in search of nuts and pleasure, and had spent one of their gayest and happiest days together. Then, he had acted so strangely that evening, and then, she had not exchanged a dozen words with him since, and the gulf was widening every hour between them. Could she even be friends with Estelle, and try to help through her? Perhaps for some reason he did not want even this. How very strangely he had acted! Since he was a man, and had a right to speak, why had he not come to her frankly, and told her the story of his discoveries, and asked her to rejoice with him in his new plans and hopes? She thought that she could have done it. She had put herself so entirely into the background, that for the time being she believed herself ready to rejoice with him in anything that gave him joy. How unaccountable it was that it had seemed to him necessary to put this old friend of his so utterly away from him, that he could not even clasp hands with her on this morning of mornings. She had it in her heart to say, "Ralph, I am so glad, God bless you," and he had given her no chance. Arriving at home, she went directly to her room and closed and locked her door, and locked the communicating door, and sat down on a low chair by the window, which was her favourite seat, and hid her face in her hands. She shed no tears, she was rarely given to tears. Be glad for her that after a few minutes of intense and nerve-straining silence, she slipped from her chair to her knees. She believed that life was thorn-spread for her, but she had found a comforter. In the parlour was Mr. Maxwell, looking for a book, and preparing to pass the brief interval of time which intervened between the church service and his going out for his dinner. Contrary to her usual custom, Mrs. Edmonds lingered also. She had seen the look on her daughter's face. She knew that she must be left alone, that even the sound of someone moving about in that other room would be, perhaps, a pain to her. So she waited below, moving restlessly from one point to another, taking up and laying down first a book, then a paper. Presently, seeing Mr. Maxwell's inquiring eyes upon her, she laughed a little consciously. "I am really developing nerves in my old age," she said. "I hardly know why I should feel so disturbed. One thing I am afraid of, that I am growing suspicious and cruel in my judgments. I have no good reason for it, but I cannot believe in the sincerity of that young man who was received into the church today. I hope I may be doing him injustice, but I really could not feel as though there was anything but the merest form about it all." He did not laugh in response, as she had half expected that he would, but instead dropped the book at which he had been looking, and began a slow, thoughtful walk up and down the room, his face grave, almost sad. At last he stopped before her, still grave. "Perhaps we are both being overcritical," he said. "I must frankly confess to you that, without sufficient cause it may be, I have very much the same feeling. I have seen a little of the young man lately, and I must own that the service this morning, the part of it with which he was connected, gave me only pain. We have too many church members now whose entire moral standard is low. Still, of course, we may both be mistaken. Let us hope and pray that it may prove so." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Making Fate by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24, Sentimentalism and Fanaticism. As Marjorie had expected, very early in the week which followed that eventful Sabbath, came Estelle Douglas with her confidences. "Oh, Marjorie," she began as soon as they were left alone together, "I have something to tell you, a secret for nobody but you as yet, and it is about something so wonderful to have happened to me." Then had followed in detail the story which Marjorie had been sure she would hear. A story so glorified by being drawn through the channel of Estelle's heart that Ralph himself would not have recognized it. The commonplace words, which had been spoken, as it will be remembered he had admitted to himself, on the impulse of the moment, had sounded to Estelle's eager ears like the most passionate appeal. In full belief in her honesty, she was so translating it to Marjorie. "And I was so astonished," she said. "Oh, you cannot imagine what a surprise it was. You see, it all came upon me so suddenly. Why, I have been for years in the habit of supposing that you and Ralph were, if not formally engaged, at least so sure of each other that you did not think of anybody else. Though Ralph and I have always been good friends, you know, and I could not help noticing that of late he has taken the trouble to seek me out more than he used to. I didn't understand it, and was anxious and troubled. Actually, Marjorie, I was anxious about you some of the time. But when Ralph explained to me that that was all the merest nonsense, and that you and he had never been anything to each other but real good friends, nor had thought of any other relation in your lives, why, it made everything look entirely different. Marjorie, you who know him so well must be ready to congratulate me, I am sure. Isn't it strange that after being brought up in the same town as we have been, going to school together and all that sort of thing, and you and Ralph being so exceedingly intimate all these years, that all of a sudden, one may say, he decided that I must be his special friend for life. Still, it is not so surprising after all, when one thinks of it. People rarely marry those with whom they were intimate in childhood and early boyhood. Extremely intimate, I mean. But I certainly was very much deceived, and I think other people have been. Why, Marjorie, almost everybody thought you were engaged to Ralph Bramlett. If you had cared, dear, I never could have listened to him, of course. I don't know what I should have done, but I am so glad to know that it has all turned out just right in every way." She was very sincere. Her heart was full of love and desire for all humankind. She had not the slightest wish to hurt Marjorie. Why should she have? She was sincerely and heartily glad over her supposed discovery that there had been always an understanding of friendship between Ralph and her schoolgirl friend, and that Marjorie was at least on the verge of a very satisfactory settlement of her own future. She was a girl of a vivid imagination in some directions, and had been given, all her life, to the habit of doing much planning ahead. During the short time since there had been what she called an understanding between Ralph and herself, she had indulged in her favorite habit. One query was whether she and Marjorie were not sufficiently intimate friends to plan their marriages for the same day. The ceremonies could be performed in the church, thus giving their very large circle of acquaintances opportunity to be present. It would be peculiarly appropriate, too, she thought, since Ralph and Marjorie were such old and very intimate friends. To unite their forces would give each the opportunity to make a better display than either could do alone. Yes, she said display in connection with it. She would not have been Estelle Douglas if she had not. "One does not plan to be married but once in a lifetime," she told herself. "Why shouldn't one have everything as grand as possible? Marjorie and I would look well together. We are sufficiently unlike to set off each other's appearance." Of course it would not do to talk about it yet. She must wait for Marjorie's confidence, and even then she must suggest it to Ralph before talking it over with Marjorie. Because, she admitted to her secret self, he was inclined to have a mind of his own, and it might occur to him to dislike the entire plan. She must wait. Besides, of course she could not speak of the details of marriage until Ralph had hinted that there was such an event in expectation. With these thoughts in mind, though she would not for the world have allowed them to appear on the surface, Estelle closed her confidence by asking what she meant to be a very pointed question. "And now, Marjorie dear, I have chosen you, you see, for my most confidential friend. Told you every little particular almost, and I haven't told anybody else outside of our own family. Ralph says he has a horror of people gossiping about our affairs, and I certainly agree with him, but you are different from other people. I told him that I would like to tell you all about it, and he agreed that that was a very different matter from talking to people in general. Why, you and he are almost like brother and sister, aren't you? What a disagreeable sister he has, by the way. I never could endure Hannah Bramlett. But what I was going to ask you, dear, was, haven't you a story to tell me? We ought to be very intimate friends now, you and I. I am sure you must have something nice to tell me in return." "Yes," said Marjorie, a grave sweetness in tone and manner. "I have. I thought when I saw you coming today that I would like to tell you my story, and I have a special desire to do so after hearing yours. Something very wonderful has come to me, Estelle. After living in indifference toward him all these years, I have suddenly learned the value of a friend who has been calling after me, asking my trust and my allegiance. He has been very patient with neglect and almost insult on my part, and has waited for me. At last I have listened to his call and given myself to him. I belong to the Lord Jesus Christ, Estelle, forever." Said Estelle, "Dear me, do you mean that you have made up your mind to join the church? What a queer way you have of telling it. You don't do anything like anybody else, Marjorie, do you?" The slow colour mounted in Marjorie's face. Was there any use in coming to Estelle Douglas with confidences like these? Still she tried. "As I said, Estelle, I have a special desire to talk with you about this now. I realize how much more you and Ralph can be to each other because you both belong to Christ. How very, very glad you must have been to have seen him take the stand which he did last Sunday." Estelle regarded her with curious, wondering eyes. This was so unlike the story which she had expected to hear. "Yes," she said, after a moment. "Of course I was glad. It was very nice of him to join the church. How splendid he looked, didn't he? I heard ever so many speak of it. I have always thought him fine looking, but I never saw him look so well as he did last Sunday. That is the most becoming suit of clothes he ever had, and I think it was nice in him to wear it then for the first time. It showed such respect for the service, you know. Oh, I was delighted, you may be sure, but awfully surprised. I didn't know a thing about it until I heard his name announced from the pulpit. Glyde came home from somewhere the night before with a story to the effect that he was going to be received the next day. But I laughed at it. I said people were always talking about Ralph, and that was the last idea they had gotten up. I thought, of course, he would have mentioned it, or that I should have heard of it in some way, if there had been any foundation for the report. Wasn't it queer in him to keep it so private, even from me? Did you know anything about it beforehand, Marjorie?" "No," said Marjorie, glad for Estelle's sake that she could answer promptly in the negative, but dismayed to think that these two were beginning their life together in this way. How extraordinary that Ralph should not want to talk it all over with the one whom he had chosen, explaining to her the wonderful revelation which he must have had, and the solemn conclusions which he must have reached about many things. It was not like Ralph to be so reticent. "I tell you everything," he had said to her not 6 months before. "A plan is only half formed in my mind before I have to rush off to you with the story of it." She had rejoiced in his confidences. She was not, like Estelle, given to making or receiving them. She had felt that she was Ralph's only confidential friend. But now that he had changed everything, of course that entire oneness of feeling, which had seemed to be between him and herself, ought to be a mark of this new relation which he had formed. Actually, she began to be anxious for them. No, not for them, for him. She wanted him to begin entirely right and to be entirely happy. Her love for him had by no means turned to bitterness. She must name it friendship hereafter, but it was honest, earnest friendship. Every good gift that earth had to bestow she claimed for him. She believed in him as thoroughly as ever girl believed in man. He had done wrong, she felt, in not trusting her, in not being sure that she would be his friend and helper, though she was to have nothing more, but that was because she had not shown him plainly enough her better nature, so that he could dare to trust it. If she had seemed selfish and exacting to him, he could not help that. She wanted all womanly graces for Estelle, because she was his promised wife. She wanted to love her, help her. She yearned over her almost as a mother might over a child. Suddenly Estelle, who was 2 years older than herself, seemed young and ignorant of the world compared with herself. "Perhaps he wanted to give you a beautiful surprise," she said, speaking a part of her thought aloud. "Estelle, I am glad for you that Ralph has settled the question of all questions. You will be able to help each other in a truer sense than you could have done without this. And to help other people. There is so much to be done in the world. It seems strange that I never realized it before. I don't think Ralph will be a half-hearted Christian. I look for him to be a power in the church, for both of you to have great influence." She added this last part of the sentence hastily. "What good times you and he can have, reading and studying the Bible together, and praying, and planning your work for Christ together." There was an exalted light in her eyes as she spoke, and no tremble of her lips. She had not for nothing spent half the night praying over this entire matter. "Estelle," she added earnestly, "begin right. Don't make the mistake of putting Ralph first. That is natural for us women. We have to watch it. Put Christ first, and live a strong life for him. It is in that way that you can best help your husband. My religion means so much to me. I have known this powerful friend of mine but a few days, and yet it seems as though he had accomplished great things for me already. Excuse me if I seem to be giving advice. I am inclined to forget that other people know him much better than I do." Estelle laughed a little in a half-embarrassed way. "You are an enthusiast," she said. "You remind me of Glyde. She has gotten some new and queer ideas since she went to New York. By the way, the child had a talk with Ralph, don't you think? The idea! And I had never dared to open my lips to him on the subject. I must ask him now just what she said. It was before we were engaged. Why, Marjorie, of course we will live as Christian people ought to, when we live together. That is a time away in the distance, I presume. We have not begun to plan for it. But I do not think that I was ever intended to to get into a fever of enthusiasm about matters of this kind. I'm a plain, practical person. I believe in doing church work, of course, and in being identified with all its interests in a reasonable way. If I had any money to give, I should like to give it through the church. I always thought that would be great fun. Ralph will have to do that part. I shouldn't wonder if he would be a rich man one of these days, Marjorie. Despite his anxiety to study law, he is developing into quite a businessman. Father heard that young Mr. Snyder say that he was the best bookkeeper they ever had, and that they meant to hold on to him and make it worth his while to stay with them. "Nothing could make it worth his while," said Marjorie, with a sudden flash of indignation which was more like her old self than anything Estelle had seen that morning. "I do not believe he will remain there. I do not see how any motives which have to do with money-making or mere business advantages can have weight with him now. He owes it to his position as a Christian to throw his entire influence on the side of right, and while he is engaged in helping to manage such a business as the Snyders, he cannot do this." "Oh, well," said Estelle, rather coldly, "people have different ways of looking at these things. I never saw anything very wrong about his being bookkeeper in an establishment. He has nothing whatever to do with the business. If he were offered a partnership, that might be another matter. But as it is, that is being sentimental, Marjorie. Ralph isn't sentimental. I wonder you and he got along together so long as you did, for you are very much so. I think Ralph has a splendid streak of real good common sense, and that he showed it when he refused to stay around home and wait for an opportunity to his mind, but went right to work in the first place that opened for him. He has done some very nice things for his mother since he began to get a regular salary. I don't know how they would have gotten along, now that she is sick, without his help. There are worse things in the world than a $1,500 salary, and I should think none the worse for Ralph for looking twice at it before he decided to give it up for a mere sentiment. Still, there is no use in our discussing it. Ralph has a mind of his own, and will do as he likes. You made that discovery some time ago, didn't you?" On the whole, the talk closed most unsatisfactorily. Estelle went home feeling annoyed over what she chose to consider a criticism of Ralph. All the more sensitive, be it confessed, because her father had expressed himself frankly as disapproving of a distillery clerk for a son-in-law. As for Marjorie, there was a sinking feeling at her heart that Estelle was not calculated, in the truest sense of the word, to be a help to Ralph Bramlett. There was also a dreary fear that she would not be able to help either of them in the ways in which she had tried to plan. In point of fact, she had little opportunity to try to help them. The intimacy which both girls had sincerely intended to cultivate did not make progress. Marjorie took an early opportunity to return Estelle's call, and was quite as friendly and social as she knew how to be, but already there had come to Estelle a mysterious change. She said nothing about their being confidential friends, or of Marjorie being like a sister to Ralph. She talked much about that young man, it is true, speaking of him always with a certain air of appropriation which would have been amusing if Marjorie had felt like being amused, but at the same time with a certain reticence as regarded his affairs, which was as new as it was mysterious. Neither would she allow herself to be approached in the slightest degree upon the religious side of her nature. "You were not at prayer meeting last evening?" began Marjorie, by way of trying to introduce the thoughts which were uppermost in her mind. "No, Ralph had a headache and was nearly tired to death. I told him I did not think it was his duty to attend the prayer meeting while he was kept at business as late as he was last night. There is something besides prayer meetings to be thought of in this world. I just squarely coaxed him to stay with me instead." She said this with a little defiant toss of her head, as though she expected Marjorie to disagree with her, and would rather enjoy having her do so. "He spoke of prayer meeting, and said perhaps we ought to go, and I said perhaps we ought not to do any such thing, that I had been a member of the church a good deal longer than he had, and ought to be the better judge. I don't believe you can make either of us into fanatics, Marjorie," with a little unmusical laugh. "I told Ralph something of what you said the other day. What do you suppose was his reply? He said you were the sort of material of which they used to make martyrs in the times when martyrs were fashionable. But he and I are not. We are real flesh and blood beings. Glyde now is developing into a regular fanatic. She will be a disciple after your own heart. Last night there was a little gathering at the Gardners'. New people, you know, and very choice. Harmon Gardner seems really to have taken quite a fancy to Glyde. She was invited last night, only 12 or 20 young people were honored, even Fanny and I were not invited, no one but Glyde. And Harmon Gardner wanted to call for her and take her there. Do you believe the child would not go? Simply because it was prayer meeting night. Mother told her she thought she might be excused under such special circumstances. She hasn't been going out much, you know, and this was a choice opportunity. Even Ralph tried to influence her. He told her she was standing in her own light, and that she must allow her judgment to come in and help settle some matters. It was all of no sort of use. She was just as firm as any little martyr you ever heard of. Not a step would she go, and she told Harmon Gardner the reason. He called early in the evening to see if he might come for her at the proper time, and she got it off to him just as though it was an excuse that he could appreciate. It was the regular prayer meeting evening in her church, and she had resolved not to let anything but necessity interfere with her going. "I am very sorry," I heard him say in a disappointed tone. "I wish this were a necessity." He acted as though he did not care whether the other guests came or not. I was provoked with Glyde. Ralph says Harmon Gardner is a very superior young man. But that is what happens to people when they get fanatical, Marjorie. They take leave of their common sense. I shall have to confess that I'm glad Ralph isn't of that sort. By the way, that reminds me of his sister. You wouldn't have picked her out for a religious fanatic, would you? Notwithstanding the fact that she looks as though she had been a martyr all her days, but she has taken up a new role very lately. Nobody knows what has started her. She wants to go out to the mission on Sunday afternoons, wants Ralph to drive her there and wait while she picks up somebody to teach. The idea! The only day of rest that he has. He told her it was out of the question for him to spend his Sabbath time in that way, and that if she got there she must walk. She was quite wrought up about it, he says. She has gotten an idea that she ought to be doing somebody some good. Suppose you go and call upon her, Marjorie. Perhaps you will find her just to your mind. End of section 24. Chapter 25 of Making Fate by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Opportunities. The last sentence had closed with the most disagreeable form of Estelle's disagreeable little laugh, and Marjorie had gone away a few minutes thereafter, wondering sorrowfully what could have come between them since their last talk together. Estelle had been indifferent enough then, but not almost bitter. Could it be that she had an unfortunate way of talking about religious matters which awakened the prejudices of others? And were Ralph and Estelle between them going to make little Glyde's life a trial, instead of a joy to herself and a blessing to others? She was right in her impression of a barrier having been set up between Estelle and herself since their last meeting. Many of her words on that occasion had been reported to Ralph. Not carefully, for Estelle was not by nature a careful reporter. As has been said before, she gave often her impression of facts, instead of the facts themselves. Therefore, the unpleasant impression she had received from Marjorie's criticism of Ralph's business was duly reported in such a way that they made Ralph's dark face flush and his eyes look fierce. For instance, this: "Don't you believe, Ralph, she says you cannot be a Christian because you are a clerk in a distillery. Did you ever hear of such absurd nonsense?" "Indeed," he had said haughtily. "What am I then, a hypocrite?" After hearing all that Estelle had to tell, he had said with almost an air of authority, "I think, my dear, that the less you have to do in the future with that young woman, the better it will be for you and for all concerned. She is evidently not the Marjorie we used to know intimately. Constant fellowship with a fanatic and a prig are making their impress upon her. She has chosen her own ways, and must be allowed to go in them. It will be just as agreeable, perhaps, if our ways do not lie in the same direction." And then Estelle, who had fancied that he would like it if she would be very intimate with Marjorie, immediately changed her intention, somewhat relieved thereat, admitting, not only to herself but to him, that Marjorie was not quite to her mind. She liked her, of course, as did all the girls, but then she had always been queer, and was queerer now since she had taken up these peculiar ideas with regard to religion. "She has become simply an echo of Mr. Maxwell," she added, laughing. "It is undoubtedly his influence which has so changed her. He is, as you say, a fanatic. I have not exchanged a dozen sentences with him, but I can see that. I wonder if your influence will be as forceful over me as his is over her. At least I am glad that you are not fanatically inclined. Well, I shall have as little to do with her as politeness will permit." So it came to pass that, after this exchange of calls, there were days, even weeks together, when the two did not meet. Marjorie had by no means cast off either Estelle or Ralph. She had prayed and was praying for them too earnestly to do this. She thought about them a great deal, always coupling their names in her thoughts with a resolute determination which would have been pitiful to one who could understand the human heart. Loyalty in thought, as well as in action, was a necessity to a nature like hers. She watched for the two each week in the prayer meeting, but they did not come. Part of the time it was headache and disinclination, but often, so far as Ralph was concerned, it was genuine detention at his place of business. As the weeks went by, and he succeeded in proving himself a success in his work, more and more heavy responsibility was laid upon him, and more entirely was he trusted. This was all very pleasant from one point of view, but it made his work hard, and his evenings sometimes short and full of anxiety. Meantime, Marjorie received one day an unexpected call from Hannah Bramlett. She had never been intimate with this young woman, chiefly perhaps because of the disparity in their ages, and while she had not shared the manifest dislike of Estelle Douglas, she yet confessed to herself that she did not feel drawn to the girl in any way. Intimate as she had been with Ralph during these many years, she and his sister had not exchanged a dozen calls in their lives, and of late had had hardly even a speaking acquaintance. It was therefore with surprise, and a little nervous query as to why she had come and what they should talk about, that Marjorie went down to receive her. "I have been wanting to come and see you for a week or two," began Hannah abruptly, as soon as the ordinary civilities had been exchanged. "I wanted to have a talk with you. I heard you had been converted. Is it so? Why, I knew it must be so. You go to prayer meeting every week now, they say, and have taken a class in Sunday school. I want to teach in the Sunday school, but there is no one to go with me anywhere. I wish there were, or else that women did not have to be hedged in by all sorts of rules. Well, that's not what I came for. What I wanted to talk to you about was doing things. The church Sunday school comes at a time when I can't leave home. Mother isn't well, she doesn't get her strength back. She was a good deal sicker than they thought that time when I was away. I have to look after things a good deal that she used to see to herself. So I'm needed just at Sunday school time. Now, what is there that I can do? Perhaps you will wonder why I don't ask my own brother, since I've come to a beginner, and he is one. But the truth is, he hasn't your kind of beginning. His is Estelle Douglas's kind, and that's a pity, I think. He is in earnest, at least I hope he is, but he is young and busy and easily influenced, and Estelle Douglas isn't the sort of girl to influence a young man like that in the right way. It is a pity to have to say so. I oughtn't to do it, perhaps, since they are engaged to each other, but I'm not saying it out on the street. You know them both. I used to think, Marjorie, that you were to be my sister, and I always liked the notion. Excuse me for speaking of it," she added deprecatingly, as she saw the red on Marjorie's cheeks deepen and spread. "I don't mean to be rude. They have always called me blunt, and I suppose I am. I never succeed in saying the right thing somehow. What I mean is that you seem different from other girls. You always have been, for that matter, and I thought you would be a different kind of a Christian from others. I have never been satisfied with my religion. It is genuine, I think, what I've got of it. But you can't keep a thing like that corked up all the while, and do nothing for anybody else, and have it amount to much. Oh, I know there is work at home. That is what Dr. Ford tells me. But it is work that I can't do, except housework and things of that kind. I can do plenty of that, and I do it. I'm not planning to shirk it. But I want a little bit of the other kind, just enough to keep me alive. Mother is a Christian woman, if ever there was one, and she doesn't need any doing for in that line. And father, well, there isn't a living thing I can do for him, except to make him as comfortable as I know how, and look after his clothes and all that. Father is bound up in Ralph, and Ralph can influence him, but I can't. He doesn't even think I'm grown up yet, though I am going on to 27 years. He just thinks of me as a little girl who ought to stay at home and mind her mother and be good. And mother thinks that I am hard on Ralph because I see his faults and speak of them once in a while, when I love every hair of his head better than I do my whole body. I'd die for him any time. But there, that's nothing to do with what I want to talk about. The point is, Marjorie, isn't there a living thing for me to do in the world for somebody? I get so downright sick of myself sometimes that it doesn't seem as though I could endure myself any longer. I thought that when Ralph joined the church, perhaps it would be different. Perhaps he would go to work at something somewhere, and I could get in. I thought about his coming home early on prayer meeting nights, and me having his supper ready, and he driving back to town and taking me along. But he doesn't do anything of the kind. Half the time he can't help it. He has to stay in that old distillery so late that he loses all the early trains, and a good deal of the time he doesn't come home at all until 11 or 12 o'clock. He stops at Douglas's, and has his supper there, and lounges in their back parlour, and is petted by Estelle. That is natural too, of course. I have no business to find fault with it. But it isn't the way I planned. Nothing ever was, or ever will be, I presume. But I just thought that I would come and have a talk with you, and ask if you knew anything in life that a body like me could do. Isn't there a poor girl or a poor boy somewhere who hasn't any friends whom even I could help?" Marjorie regarded her caller with the deepest interest and sympathy. This was different from any Hannah Bramlett that she had known. Her talk sounded like the cry of a hungry soul. Would it be possible, for one who felt the need of being herself set to work, to help this other one? "There are people enough who need your help," she said at last, "if we only knew where to find them. With so much to be done in the world, it is an infinite pity that one who is willing to work should not find the people and the opportunity. The people who need helping are more easily found than the opportunity. I have been thinking all the morning of one who is in sore need, but how to reach him in any way I haven't the least idea." "Have you ever heard of a man by the name of Jack Taylor? I have become painfully interested in him quite lately. It is only a short time since he buried his wife. While she lay dead in the house, he reeled home intoxicated, not knowing what had happened. It was a terrible shock to him, sobered him at once. He has been in a wretched condition ever since. It seems that the poor fellow loved her, in spite of his treatment of her, and now that it can do her no good, he is trying to reform. But it is going to be very hard work. He is utterly discouraged. He feels that he has disgraced himself in the eyes of all who know him, and that he has no friends. "I know a Jack Taylor, by sight," said Hannah, "but he cannot be the one you are talking about. This one is a mere boy. I noticed him a few days ago passing our house, and asked father who he was. He said he was a worthless fellow whose name was Jack Taylor. He had secured work at the Simmons place, that is half a mile or so beyond us. But he supposed he wouldn't keep it long, because he didn't stay sober 24 hours at a time. The character fits the one you know, but this fellow cannot be more than 19. "It is the same one," said Marjorie. "He looks like a boy, and is a boy in fact, not 22 yet, though he has been married nearly 2 years. We heard that he had gotten work at the Simmons place. I do hope he can keep it. If he did not have to pass a dozen saloons on his way out there, I should have more hope of him. He goes back and forth, you say? I wonder if it would not be possible for them to let him sleep there nights, so that he would not be subject to so much temptation?" "I don't know," said Hannah. "I wonder if it can be possible that that poor fellow is a widower. It is a pity to have so young a life wasted. I couldn't help noticing him as he passed. He looked so utterly discouraged, as though he had lost all hope in the world. I might set a trap for him at our house perhaps, and have him step in and get a little acquainted." "I wish you would," said Marjorie earnestly. "Perhaps that is your opportunity. Somebody will have to help him, and that very soon, if he is to be saved. Wouldn't it be a glorious thing if you could lead him to the only one who can save him?" She was touched to see how Hannah's face brightened. The woman was actually longing to be of use in the world. "I might try it," she said, rising to go, and speaking with half-suppressed eagerness, as though she could hardly wait for the opportunity. "I never have helped anybody, so far as I know, and I don't suppose I know how, but he looks miserable enough for me to make the trial. I couldn't make matters worse than they are now, at least." She went away with a brisk step, and Marjorie prayed for Jack Taylor that night with more faith than she had been able to exercise before. During the weeks which followed, life settled with Marjorie into a sort of routine. Not by any means, however, a stagnation. She set herself resolutely at work to be systematic and faithful in all that she undertook. She planned her days with utmost care. She began to give regular attention to her music once more, and took up a neglected study of German, with Mr. Maxwell for a tutor. In one way or another she and her mother continued to see much of Mr. Maxwell. Nothing could be more natural or unpremeditated on their part than this, since he was a lodger in their own house and spent much of his time at home. The evening readings continued, and broadened in their scope. Not popular books alone, so called, but real mental studies came in for their share of attention. Books which Mr. Maxwell was reading in line with his work, and which he insisted were much better appreciated when he had an audience. Then a very earnestly put question from Marjorie when she met him in the hall one morning, concerning the best ways of reading and studying the Bible, led him to ask, soon afterwards, if she and her mother would be willing to join him in a systematic course of Bible study, which he had laid out for himself. He had planned to give 1 hour of each evening to it, to accomplish as much as he could in that time, and then turn resolutely away from it. He added with a smile that he had discovered the study of the Bible to be the most fascinating of all pursuits, and that, unless he hedged himself in with hours and minutes, He was very much given to neglecting other work for this favourite study. Nothing that he had heretofore proposed had given Marjorie so much satisfaction. She felt more or less able to pursue other studies by herself, but had been astonished and humiliated to discover what a very child she was in her knowledge of the Bible. A multitude of verses she knew, and great was the help and comfort which she derived from them. But any consecutive knowledge of the book, or as a compilation of many authors, or as a history, reaching over a long period of time, she found she had not. It came to pass, therefore, that every otherwise disengaged evening was systematically appropriated in this way, and the back parlour of the Edmonds home became to all intents and purposes a schoolroom. The Bible study came first. They gave it the best of their evening, from 7 until 8 o'clock, and they grew so interested in their work, both mother and daughter, that very often Mr. Maxwell's inexorable closing of the books as the mantel clock tolled 8 was met by reproachful looks from them both. From 8 to 9 they took up the historical study which Mr. Maxwell was pursuing in a line with his writing. Very delightful study it was to Marjorie, and, apparently, quite as satisfactory to her mother. But the daughter often had qualms of conscience, when alone, over the thought that their teacher must surely be wasting very valuable time upon them. It was eminently courteous in him to call it study for himself, but nothing was more apparent than that he was already thoroughly conversant with his theme. No question that she could ask found him unprepared, and he welcomed questions so eagerly, and was so thorough in his replies, and led them so constantly into other lines of thought, that while they made comparatively little progress with the textbook, Marjorie realized that she was gaining a very great deal out of the hour. Once or twice she hinted her fears, but he met them graciously, assuring her that he was getting out of those evenings much more than he could explain to her, and that to review some of his former work in this direction was exactly the help which he needed for his book. Of course, after that there was nothing more to be said. From 9 until 10 they recreated, as Mr. Maxwell called it. Always there was some standard popular book to be taken up, and with these three, to take up a book meant not a hurried reading, getting over the ground for the sake merely of the plot, after the manner of superficial novel readers. They read for the sake of the ideas and the language, even more than for the plot. Nay, they read more for the moral lessons, or for the moral power evolved from the characters they studied, than they did for either of these other reasons. The consequence was that they stopped and studied over what they read, comparing views and considering theories of their own which the book suggested. So that, as Mr. Maxwell said gaily one evening, "We are making books as well as reading them. Occasionally I have the egotism to think that if we should write out our conversations carefully, we might chance to make a book which the world would like to read, and be the better for the reading, which is much more important. It would be very easy to write a book which the world would like to read, if one did not care how one influenced that world." The German lessons came on what Mr. Maxwell announced was a leisure hour of his afternoons. On the whole, what with the work in the missionary society she had joined, and looking after the 7 girls in her Sunday school class, Marjorie's time was quite fully employed. Of course, though they two lived alone and quite simply, there were more or less duties in the housekeeping line which fell to Marjorie. This had always been the case, and so far was she from disliking such work, that she had rather prided herself upon her skill in that direction. The taste grew upon her rather than decreased, and she planned and executed many a dainty dish for Mr. Maxwell to carry to some of his numerous friends. Especially did the old professor and his wife have reason to rejoice in her constantly developing fondness for culinary matters. Not a week passed without some choice concoction of hers finding its way to their little round table, at which Mr. Maxwell confessed that he often made a third. The old gentleman used to be his favorite teacher away back in his early boyhood, and his love for and faith in him had increased with his increasing years. He admitted that he found a conversation with him now a better stimulus than almost anything else within his reach. So Marjorie planned liberally for 3, and often packed with her own careful hands the basket which was to furnish the entire supper for the trio. Of course, she was not without her hours for recreation. They began to take long walks together as the spring opened, she and her mother. And more frequently as the days grew sunnier and the roads drier, did Selim appear at the gate, attached to a low, wide-seated carriage, while his owner explained that he had an errand on the Foundry Road, or the River Road, or in the direction of the park, and was very tired of driving alone. Would not Mrs. Edmonds and Miss Edmonds keep him company? It was always Mrs. Edmonds whom he asked first, and she always went. They were really constantly together, mother and daughter, during those days, their companionship seeming more like that of an elder and younger sister. If Mrs. Edmonds sometimes sacrificed her own tastes and inclinations, and gave herself to walks and drives when she would rather have stayed quietly at home, she made no sign, but lived in the joy of her daughter's systematic, cheerful energy, for Marjorie was cheerful from morning till night. It is true her face was more often grave than otherwise, and her mother missed something of the merry playfulness which used to sparkle out on the slightest provocation, but there was no lack of cheer. It was a sweet, strong gravity, with not a trace of sullenness in it, and she made her life so busy and so regular that there was little time for brooding. She had been resolute about many things, and made her own little sacrifices too, of which she said nothing. That communicating door was opened early now each night. She wrote no words at all in her diary, and she would not let herself think connectedly about any of that part of her past which she felt did not now belong to her. Was she then forgetting Ralph Bramlett? You who understand young, true hearts smile over the question. They do not so easily forget. She made no attempt to deceive herself, but owned that she had loved Ralph Bramlett. But she remembered that he had of his own choice given her up and chosen another. It would not only be a weakness, but a sin for her to dally now and sentimentalize over the broken past. If she meant to be true to herself, to her mother, and above all to God, she must put away that which was not for her, and live for what God had given her. With the utmost of her strong, young will, she was doing this. She believed that love and marriage, and all that was involved in those two sacred words, had been taken out of her life, but she must not therefore waste it. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Making Fate by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Robbie. It is almost a pity that at this stage of her career Marjorie Edmonds could not have gone up and down the world as an apostle of common sense. She fully realized that she had given her young, true heart into the keeping of another, and that other had been what she called mistaken in himself, and deserted her. She had so managed the whole matter in her thoughts, that in some way she had succeeded in exonerating him from all blame. People could not love to order, she told herself. If he found that Estelle was the one for his life friend, and she was not, no other course had been open to him save the one he had taken. Except, perhaps, that had he understood her better, he could have done it in a better way. But the point to be noted is, that she did not, because of this experience, conclude that she had a broken heart and must henceforth make herself and all about her miserable. She did not even intend to be unhappy. There is a sense in which she would not allow herself to be. If the holy and blessed experiences of love and marriage were not for her, there was yet a beautiful, helpful life befitting a daughter of the King for her to live. She meant to live it. She assured herself that only sin could make people utterly miserable, and then she instantly corrected even that view and said, "I mean only unforgiven sin." And in that, she had gotten above the sickly sentimentality which talks about wasted affections and blighted hopes, as if there were nothing else in life but these, and that because of a bitter experience one must go about thereafter a ruined soul. We have a right to be proud of her, and to hold her up as a model, not only for people of common sense, but preeminently for people who call themselves Christians to follow. Is it not time for us to remember that upon those who belong to the family of Jesus Christ, and are called to be joint heirs with him, no real blight can fall? At the same time, it is not denied that the experience through which Marjorie had passed had left its mark. Among other ways in which it showed, was that one connected with social life. She ceased to be the center of a certain circle, as she had undoubtedly been for a year or two. She went very little into society, and almost entirely avoided places at which her mother was not expected. Yet, after all, perhaps this last was not so different from what the world had been accustomed to in her. Mrs. Edmonds had often gone to gatherings for Marjorie's sake, from which she would much rather have been excused, and both Ralph and Marjorie had often, in the past, been grumbled at for declining invitations, with no better reason on the girl's part than that she did not like to leave mother so much alone, Ralph reserving to himself the right to decline all invitations that he chose, without any excuse whatever. It was the dull season of the year, however, in the society in which they had heretofore moved, the time when the real victims of society life were trying to rally from the dissipations of the winter, and get themselves refreshed in strength and wardrobe for the summer's campaign. There was therefore not so much necessity for breaking in upon their choice home evenings. It perhaps cannot be denied that there was a disposition on Marjorie's part to avoid any place of entertainment where she had reason to suppose that Ralph and Estelle would be. She had considered the question with deliberation, and determined that it was not at present her duty to make the sacrifice which this would demand. Had her intimacy with Estelle, which she had planned, developed, and the relations of honest, earnest friendship which she intended, been evolved, she would have managed this matter of society differently. But as it was, it had not only become painful to her, but was evidently disagreeable to Estelle to have any sort of conversation with her, and in the few times which they had met, the interviews were so far from being either helpful or agreeable, that Marjorie felt justified in deciding that the less they should see of each other for the present, the better it would be. "Estelle dislikes me," she told herself gravely, "quite as much as I was at one time in danger of disliking her. It is not dislike that I feel now, at least I do not think it is, but I do not enjoy her society, and so long as I do her no good, but rather harm apparently, every time I meet her, why should we make martyrs of ourselves?" So she planned a little. It required very little planning. Spring had brought complications in Ralph's business which held him to long hours and perplexing mental work. At the various church gatherings in which Marjorie and her mother interested themselves to an unusual degree, neither Estelle nor Ralph appeared. As a matter of fact, they had not found time to attend even one of those midweek prayer meetings, for which Ralph had magnanimously arranged when he decided to unite with the church. So that at places where she had expected to meet them as a matter of course, Marjorie suffered no such embarrassment. In the early spring, the Gardners, with whom Estelle was becoming intimate, gave a large party, and invited Marjorie and her mother. But it chanced that Mrs. Edmonds was at the time suffering from a slight cold, and felt it unwise to expose herself to the evening air, so that the invitation, with this for an excuse, was promptly declined. But if Marjorie's intimacy with Estelle had come to naught, her friendship with Glyde progressed rapidly. It was a sort of one-sided intercourse which they had. Marjorie went very rarely indeed to the Douglas home, but Glyde came constantly to see her. The young girl seemed instinctively to understand why this state of things should be, and made no complaint or comment because her almost daily visits were not returned. There were always reasons for her coming. She was by no means an idler in the church. There was a discouraged mission band which was dragging out a spiritless existence. Glyde heard of it almost by accident, so quiet did the young ladies keep even their organization. She had invited herself to become a member, and had taken hold of the matter with an energy that foreshadowed success. The girls, astonished and at first almost appalled over the new life which had been infused into their midst, began to rouse themselves and take hold of some plans with energy. And Glyde was continually coming to Mrs. Edmonds and Marjorie for suggestions. Nor had she by any means either forgotten or relinquished her desire to work among the poor, friendless little children, who were without aprons and pretty things. There could be nothing systematic in this direction while she was so young. Her mother, not always careful what her older daughters did, shielded this youngest one with a very tender care, and shrank back with horror from the thought of her taking up any work which looked like district visiting. Yet, little by little, without that name attached, or without formality of any kind, Glyde had almost a district on her roll. There was a girl in Mrs. Watson's class who had a sick sister at home, lying day after day on a dreary little bed, and nothing bright or cheery ever came to her, so far as Glyde could learn, save what Mrs. Watson, who was poor, and crowded with home cares, could accomplish out of her busy life. Such joy and brightness as gathered around that little bed, after Glyde made its acquaintance, one might fill a volume in describing. There was a boy of whom she heard by accident, living on an entirely safe and respectable street, where she felt sure her mother would be willing to have her visit. The boy was a cripple. He was helped into his chair in the morning, and helped out of it at night, when his mother came home. All day long he lived his lonely little life, his only company being such picture papers as his mother could occasionally pick up through her friends in the mill. Glyde's fingers fairly trembled with joy when she wrote his name on her list. She knew of so many bright things that she could put into his life. Mrs. Edmonds accompanied her on her first visit, to satisfy the girl's mother that no reasonable excuse could be offered for prohibiting her, and after that Glyde went twice a week with her packages of books, papers, writing materials, crayons, water-colors, and what not. Such joy came with her into that poor little home where love had been struggling all alone, as the mother had believed was not possible for her boy until he found it through the gateway of the grave. Oh, there were lovely things that Glyde could do, though she was still young and fair, and must be shielded from the coarse and the low and the brutal as much as possible. She had 2 or 3 girl acquaintances now, of the kind which she had met in New York. Pale-faced, hard-working girls in cotton gloves, or very much mended kid ones, or quite often no gloves at all. They held aloof from her for a time, even tossed their heads when she tried to bow, looked the other way when she wanted to speak to them. In short, they passed through the various periods of insolence, superciliousness, cold reserve, and wondering, doubtful half-concessions, and finally became not only her devoted admirers, but friends, girls who would have been willing to die for her, if need be. She told Marjorie a great deal about them, and that young woman and her mother added to their other duties and cares plans for helping Glyde's girls. All things considered, it was by no means a dull or long spring to the little circle which understood one another and worked together. The month of April had retired into the background, and May was bringing the breath of early flowers and the hint of summer in her sunshiny train, when one afternoon Glyde Douglas tripped up the steps of the Edmonds home and pulled the bell in a little more eager and impatient manner than usual. She was in such extreme haste to get inside with her bit of news that if the door had not been locked she would have waited for no ceremony. However, she had to wait, and there came presently a little frown of disappointment on her bright face. The bell was not answered. Nobody was at home. How very provoking, when she had wanted to see them on such special and important business. Where could they all be so early in the afternoon? They must have gone for a long drive. It was too early for their usual walk. Well, there was nothing for it but to wait. She must call upon Robbie first then, and keep from telling him the beautiful piece of news if she could. Though she felt very much as though she must tell somebody. Still feeling in the hurry of excitement, though the special need for haste was over, she made all speed for the corner, signaled a passing car, and rode out to the quiet, dull part of the town where the houses were poor and small and respectable. Leaving the car at the corner, she walked down a street which was still narrower, and where there was still smaller and poorer respectability, stopping at last before a tiny cottage with one front window. This was her crippled boy's home. He was sitting by the window, and the air was so mild that it was open a little way. He clapped his small, blue-veined hands at sight of his caller. "Goody!" he said gleefully. "I was afraid you couldn't come." He was nearly 14 years old, but his 4 years of helplessness and frailness had made him look and appear much younger. "I've been watching for you this hour. I've got something nice to tell you," he added, as Glyde let herself in and came to his side. "So have I," thought Glyde, "only I must not tell you, not yet. It would be even harder for you to wait than it is for me." "Have you?" she said aloud, placing a lovely white lilac in his hand as she spoke. "I like nice things. I wonder what it is. Can I guess? You have found another word in your puzzle, one that you and I couldn't make out." "No," he said, laughing gleefully. "It isn't that." "Then you have made with your paints just the right shade for that queer flower which we were trying to copy, and that I was to ask Miss Edmonds about the next time I saw her." "Oh, did you ask her?" said Robbie. "Because I haven't found it, Miss Glyde. I've tried every paint in my box, and it doesn't make it." "Good," she said. "Yes, I asked her, and I have the right box of paints in my bag this minute, with the one marked that will make exactly the shade we are after. So Miss Edmonds says, and she knows. They are lovely colors, Robbie. We can make ever so many pretty things with them that we couldn't with your others. I suspect they cost a good deal more than the others did. Mr. Maxwell sent them to you." "Oh, goody, goody!" said Robbie, his small hands clasped in ecstasy. "I'm just as glad! Now I can finish coloring that card for Mother's birthday, can't I? To think of my being able to make a present for Mother! Isn't everybody good to me? But you haven't guessed my news, Miss Glyde." She was bending over him, pinning a spray of bloom to his buttonhole, and smiling at his eager, upturned face. What a lovely boy Robbie was! And how bright and glad he was over the little bits of brightness which she could put into his life. It seemed very strange to her that he should have been forgotten and neglected so long. "No," she said, "I'm afraid I cannot guess after all. When I was a schoolgirl they used always to have to tell me the answers to conundrums and things of that kind that others puzzled over. I liked to puzzle other people, but I was never good at guessing things for myself. What is it, Robbie? Tell me about it." As she spoke, she drew the little rocker which Mr. Maxwell had sent for the mother to rest in when her long day's work was done, and placed it in just the position that Robbie liked, so he could look at her. "Why," said Robbie, "I've got another friend, a splendid young man. He came to see me yesterday and the day before, and he is coming again to-day." Nothing more delightful than the boy's pure, eager face and great brown eyes can be imagined as he told off this wonderful bit of news. "Oh!" said Glyde, in gleeful sympathy. "What a splendid thing! I never could have guessed so grand a secret as that." She thought at once of Mr. Maxwell. He had promised to come during some leisure hour and call upon Robbie, but up to this time, having many protégés of his own, and feeling that the boy was in good hands, he had not, so far as Glyde had known, redeemed the promise. Although Robbie felt well acquainted with him, and had received flowers and fruits as well as books by his kindness, Glyde being the medium through which they were bestowed. Of course Robbie's new friend must be Mr. Maxwell. He must have chosen not to tell his name, since Robbie did not mention it. If this were the case, of course she must not betray his secret, so she asked no questions in that line. "Yes," said Robbie, "it is a great thing. The way he came to get acquainted with me, Miss Glyde, I was sitting here by the window, and mother said I might have it open just a little bit to get a smell of spring. She fixed it so I could push it down if the wind began to blow. That is, I mean, she thought she did, but she wedged the block in a little bit too much, or got it a little too far from me. All of a sudden the wind began to blow real hard, and I tried to shut the window. I worked, and couldn't seem to get strength enough in my hand to push that block out. And just as I said aloud, 'Oh, dear me, I don't know what to do. Mother won't like to have the wind blow on me,' that young man came along, and don't you think he heard what I said. 'What's up, my boy?' he asked me, and then I told him about the window, and my not being able to move, you know, and all that. I told it real quick, because the wind was blowing, and before I got it quite told, he sprang up the steps and opened the door. 'Walk in,' he said, just as if I had told him to." And Robbie stopped to laugh. "And then he rushed over to this window, and with one touch of his little finger he got the block out of the way and the window shut. Then he sat down in that chair, right where you are sitting, and said he, 'Now I guess we are acquainted, aren't we, young man, and can have a visit.' Wasn't he splendid? And we had, oh, such a nice visit. He asked me if he could come again, and he said he had a pocket about him somewhere, he guessed, that would hold something. The next time he would see what he could do with it. And the next time he came, that was yesterday, he had an orange in one pocket and a great big apple in another, and the loveliest card in a little pocket. Here it is, Miss Glyde. See, it has a picture of Christ on it, healing people. If Christ were walking along the streets today as he was then, and I should call out to him, he would stop and heal me right away, wouldn't he, Miss Glyde?" Glyde could scarcely keep the tears from her voice as she answered. "He is in the world now, Robbie, just the same, you know. He would heal you now if it were the best thing for you. Perhaps he will some day." Robbie shook his head. "No, the doctors told mother that I couldn't ever be well. But then, maybe they didn't know this doctor." A sudden light of interest shining in his eyes. "There wasn't any couldn't to him, was there, Miss Glyde?" "Only the couldn't which was made by its not being best for people," said Glyde with confidence. "He knows everything, remember. Perhaps he knows that it is best for you not to be well here. There might be a best that we didn't understand at all." "Yes," said Robbie gravely. "That's so. If I could walk, I might grow up and be a bad man. There is a woman works at the mill near mother. She had a little boy once who was hurt just in the same way I was, only it wasn't his back. He was sick a long time, and he got well. But now he drinks and gets drunk and knocks her when he comes home at night. Knocks his mother, Miss Glyde. Just think of it. I'd rather have to sit here 100 years and never take a step than to get to be such a man that I'd knock my mother. Miss Glyde," with a sudden eager change of voice, "here comes my new friend. I see him hurrying along on the other side of the street. He always walks fast. He has so many nice things to do for people that he has to save his time, I guess. Would you mind brushing my hair back just a little, so it would look nice with the flower, you know?" Glyde laughed and brought the white-handled brush that Mrs. Edmonds had brought him, and brushed back the thick brown curls from the pale white forehead, and readjusted the cushions at his back. Just in time. There came a business-like knock at the door. "Come in," said Robbie's eager voice, and Glyde stood waiting with smiling eyes. What fun it would be to meet Mr. Maxwell there, and show off her boy about whom she had talked so much. Still, she could not help wondering where Mrs. Edmonds and Marjorie were, and why he did not bring them. She had felt so sure that they were out driving with him. The door had opened promptly in response to Robbie's invitation, and there had entered, not Mr. Maxwell, but a stranger. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Making Fate by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Old Acquaintances. In the act of making a respectful bow to the lady in attendance, the stranger stopped and stared, then spoke quickly. "I beg your pardon, but surely this is Miss Douglas?" "Yes," said Glyde, the pink on her cheeks flushing up into her hair. "I am Glyde Douglas. And you, I remember you perfectly. It is Mr. Burwell, is it not?" "That is my name," he said, in the tone of one who was very glad of it. Then he held out his hand. "We may shake hands, surely. We are old acquaintances, are we not, Miss Douglas? It is a great surprise as well as a great pleasure to meet you again. I have often wondered I was not aware that you lived in this part of the country. I thought you were from the West. My uncle said something about Denver." "Oh, that is where my Uncle Anthony lives, whose guest I was in New York, but this is my home. Mr. Burwell, you have made the acquaintance of my friend Robbie, he says?" Thus reminded, the astonished young man turned toward the waiting Robbie, and for the next 15 minutes the boy had no occasion to be jealous of Miss Glyde as a rival. The pockets, of which there seemed to be many, were filled with treasures. Not eatables this time, except that there was one great juicy apple, but little, thoughtful things chosen evidently with a view to relieving the weariness of the long hours which the prisoned boy must have to pass alone. Glyde, looking on, all in a flutter of pleasure for Robbie's sake, saw how tender had been the thought of this strong man for the frail boy. Then, too, she could not help noticing how wise and cheery and helpful were the words he spoke. "Did you learn that verse, my boy?" he asked. "Oh, yes," said Robbie, his great brown eyes seeming to grow larger and gentler. "I learned it right away, that afternoon, as soon as you had gone. It is a beautiful verse. Miss Glyde, I didn't tell it to you. I'll say it now. 'As one whom his mother comforteth, so will I comfort you.' Isn't that nice, Miss Glyde? Just for me, you know. Mother is such a comfort to me. There couldn't anything tell it to a boy like me better than that." Glyde and Mr. Burwell exchanged glances of significant sympathy and tenderness for the boy. Then Mr. Burwell said, "That's it, my boy. It is a beautiful verse for us fellows who have good mothers. It was the first one that made me acquainted with the Lord Jesus, and the comfort he was willing to be to people. My mother, you see, had gone to heaven, and I missed her, oh, more than I can tell. It seemed to me sometimes that I could not live without her. Then one day I came upon this verse, and it astonished me so much. I had not thought that anybody could comfort a boy like his mother, and to find that there was a great powerful one who could do anything, that was right, who had actually planned to be such a comfort to me as my mother was, and promised it. Why, I can't tell you what a splendid discovery it was." "Yes," said Robbie, "I can think it out. But you needed it awfully, didn't you? It doesn't seem to me as though I could live without my mother." There was more talk, some of it gay and frolicsome, some of it sweet and strong, all of it cheery. In the midst of it, Glyde looked at her watch and made a reluctant admission. "Robbie, I am ever so sorry, but I shall have to go now. I promised my father to do an errand for him downtown at 5 o'clock, and I shall just have time to get there." Mr. Burwell arose at once. "Then we must both go, Robbie. I have to be in a gentleman's office away down on Burke Street at 5. I had just this hour for you between times this afternoon. Miss Douglas, may I walk with you to your car, or whatever route you take?" When they were on the street together, she told him what she knew about Robbie and his unfortunate accident, and the sad outlook for his future, and also of how glad she was that he had found him and put such brightness into a few hours of his life. He listened to the story with such hearty sympathy, and had ready so many suggestions calculated to add to the boy's comfort, that Glyde felt sure here was one who could enjoy her precious secret. She unfolded it at once. Uncle Anthony, that same dear uncle who had taken her to New York. Did he remember him? She had been writing long letters to him this winter, about all her affairs, but especially had she a good deal to tell him about Robbie. Among other things, she had told him that she was thinking and praying about a great wheeled chair for the boy, such as he could himself roll along the streets. She had sent for circulars, and inquired as to kinds and prices. She did not know whether she could ever raise money enough. She was not acquainted with many people who seemed to have money to give. But she was going to try. She had asked God to help her think of the right ones to call upon. "I never thought of such a thing as asking Uncle Anthony to help," Glyde explained, "because he is not at all wealthy, and of course there are people where he lives who need to be thought about. My plan was to raise the money if I could in our own church. And don't you think he answered the letter on the very evening of the day in which he had received it? And he said, in his own quaint way, which is unlike any other person's, that he supposed by this time the one of whom I asked direction had reminded me that I ought to use my common sense as well as my prayers, and my common sense ought to have told me that he had a special corner of his heart set apart for the Robbies of the world. Didn't I remember that Aunt Estelle's little brother who died was named Robbie? Aunt Estelle is my uncle's young wife. He had her with him only a month after their marriage, but he has loved her memory all his life. And what do you think he put in his letter? A check which will cover the entire cost of the chair. The letter only came today, and I've been in such a bubble of delight over it. I just longed to tell somebody. I went to call upon a friend to explain it all to her. I wanted to ask a friend of hers to manage the correspondence about it for me, but she wasn't at home. And you are the first one I have been able to tell. I had to keep quiet before Robbie, of course. I thought it would be too much strain upon him to be expecting the chair for weeks, perhaps. Those things are delayed so often. So he doesn't know anything about it." Mr. Burwell was exactly the person for a confidence of this sort. He entered into the scheme with the deepest interest, not only, but with refreshing energy. He knew the spot of all others in New York where the best possible style of wheeled carriage could be bought for the lowest possible price. He was on a hurried business trip, looking up some details of a law case for his chiefs. He would be back in New York in 3 days' time, and nothing would give him greater pleasure than to serve her. His uncle knew one member of the firm who had to do with these carriages, and could very possibly secure a reduction from the regular price. If Miss Douglas would be at leisure that evening, and would allow him, he would call upon her, and they could then arrange the entire matter. One would have supposed that it might have troubled an honest young man to define what matters there were which needed any arrangement. There seemed nothing left to be done but to transfer Glyde's check to him. But the young lady accepted his proposition with gratitude. It did not even occur to the innocent creature that they had no known business which could occupy the evening. But there is such a thing as manufacturing business. That which these two evolved lasted for that entire evening and the next. Moreover, on the afternoon of the second day they both made a somewhat extended call upon Robbie. On the third day Mr. Burwell went back to New York to purchase the wonderful chair. But he left interests of infinite importance to himself behind him. He had secured from Glyde permission to write to her, not only concerning the chair, but about the meetings at the mission, where he was now a regular worker. Also, he was to tell her of his New York boys, who, though not in the least like Robbie, were yet in sore need of help, such help as she could give them if she would. "And girls too, Miss Douglas," he said earnestly. "Why, I know some poor girls in our mission who would feel that they had been introduced to the society of angels if they could have such an one as you for a friend." He said nothing about a young man who might possibly have like views, and Glyde was far too much in earnest to even think of such an interpretation of his words. She assured him that she would be only too glad to help his boys or his girls in any way that he thought she could, and added that it was the work to which she wanted to give her life, especially to help the class of girls of which he had just spoken. Robbie had taken many rides in his wonderful wheeled chair, and more letters had passed between Glyde and Mr. Burwell than Mrs. Douglas seemed to consider necessary, when there occurred an event in the social world which placed all party lovers on the qui vive of expectation. It will be remembered that the Schuyler farmhouse was large and roomy, and most hospitably inclined. Also that there were gay young people there who knew how to entertain their friends and kept open house at all seasons of the year. But perhaps once a year, it might be in midwinter or at the opening of summer, they varied as to seasons, the family were in the habit of throwing open every room in their delightful old house, and thronging the place with their friends. Not an ordinary party, but a joyous, old-fashioned time. They had chosen for this year's festival the month of May. Mrs. Edmonds and Marjorie had received invitations, and were considering them, among other matters of importance. One of these was connected with their lodger. In June, Mr. Maxwell's long holiday would be over. He was going abroad for the summer months, on business connected with his college, and in the following October his work as a professor would commence again in earnest. The question was, should they try to let the room which he would so soon vacate? There was no special need for this, so far as the pecuniary side was concerned. Mrs. Edmonds, though by no means a wealthy woman, had enough, prudently managed, for herself and Marjorie to live comfortably upon. The room had been rented in the first place because they often felt lonely, especially on winter nights, and liked the thought of there being someone in the house to whom they could appeal if occasion offered. Now, however, they found that they shrank from having a stranger come into their home. "It would be a very different matter if we could keep Mr. Maxwell," said the mother thoughtfully. "We know him." She seemed to forget that she had taken him as an utter stranger. "What do you think, Marjorie dear? Shall we go back to our old ways and get along alone, or shall we let our friends know that we have a vacant room?" "I don't know," said Marjorie a little wearily. "It is difficult to imagine just us two alone. We have had a lodger so long. At least it seems a very long time since Mr. Maxwell came." "Yes," said Mrs. Edmonds, "we shall miss him very much." She was looking closely at her daughter with the keen vision of an anxious mother, but the girl answered in a quiet, unresponsive tone, "Yes, of course we shall, but then I suppose we could take another stranger and get acquainted with him, and plan to miss him." She laughed a little drearily. For the moment life looked to her like a long stretch of meeting and missing people. Suddenly she turned and looked steadily at her mother with a new light in her heart, and shadowing her face. They were like girls together, people said, she and her mother, but of course they were not girls together, and the mother's hair was turning grey. She was a frail, pale mother. What if she should go away some day and leave Marjorie alone? The girl's heart seemed fairly to cease beating for a single moment, then start afresh in unnatural thuds. She was like Robbie. It seemed to her that she could not live without her mother. "Make it the way which seems easiest for you, mother," she said earnestly. "I do not care which it is, truly I don't, so that you are comfortable. If you feel lonely at the thought of our being the only ones in the house at night, take another lodger by all means. He may prove to be a second Mr. Maxwell." "I suppose, dear, you would not feel like closing the house and going away anywhere else for the winter?" asked Mrs. Edmonds hesitatingly. For the moment Marjorie forgot her desire that the mother should have exactly her way. "Oh, no," she said hurriedly. "Nor for the summer either, if we can help it. Do let us stay at home. I would rather be here than anywhere. There is my class to be thought of, and Glide's girls, and our women who depend so much upon us. Besides, this is our home, mother, yours and mine. If we went away for a time, we should only have to come back, and that would make us feel more lonely than ever. We ought to stay here, oughtn't we? We shall never have any other home, you and I." She had evidently given up all idea of any change of relations, and had no dreams of a possible, rich future, such as most happy, free-hearted girls indulge occasionally. It hurt her mother to think that this one lamb of hers was growing old and dignified before her time. Hurt her so much that sometimes she could not keep the bitterness out of her heart when she thought of Ralph Bramlett. Why should such as he be permitted to shadow the life of a girl like her Marjorie? Why did not Marjorie see his worthlessness? If she could but by some means be made to see him with her mother's eyes. Into the midst of this family council came Mr. Maxwell with a note of invitation in his hand. "The Schuylers have kindly remembered me also," he said. "I have been too much engaged during the winter for enjoyments of this kind, but I have met Mr. Schuyler, and was pleasantly impressed by him. If I knew any intimate friends of mine who were going to spend an evening at his house soon, so as to ensure a pleasant time for myself, I think I might be induced to accept this invitation." Mrs. Edmonds met this with an appreciative laugh. "I shall be glad to secure you for an ally," she said. "I have been trying to persuade Marjorie to go. The Schuylers are very old friends of ours, and it does not seem quite the courteous thing to decline an invitation of this character, with no better excuse than we have. Marjorie is disposed to think that it will be too hard an evening for me, to go so far, and to be out, of necessity, quite late. But I have assured her that I am entirely equal to an occasional dissipation of that sort. If you can induce her to think well of it, I shall be glad." She would be more glad than she cared to express to Mr. Maxwell. Being watchful and anxious, she could not help knowing that, while her daughter's face was uniformly sweet and quiet, and her interest in the new duties and cares which she had taken upon herself sincere and pronounced, yet she was by no means her old, bright self. This matter of steadily declining all invitations of a general character disturbed the mother. She understood the subtle reason for it, and knew there was danger that Marjorie might grow morbidly sensitive in this direction as the years passed, unless something occurred to change the current of her feelings. She wondered if Mr. Maxwell had a suspicion of her anxiety, and was breaking through his usual habits for a purpose. He had a curious way of seeming to know how people felt and thought without explanations of any sort. It would not be the first time, she reflected, that he had come quietly to her aid, unsuspected by Marjorie. It was fully determined that the invitation should be accepted, and that the three should go in company. Marjorie having steadily and with a determined air negatived any suggestions looking to the release of her mother. "I do not care to go, mother," she said quietly, "and do not feel, as you seem to, that courtesy demands our presence. But since you feel so, I am willing to go with you, not without you." Nevertheless, it came to pass that such was not to be the arrangement. On the afternoon of the gathering, a near neighbor of theirs, who was ill, sent to know if Mrs. Edmonds would be willing to spend the evening with her in her husband's enforced absence; and as she had been quite ill and was nervous, and had evidently set her heart upon having Mrs. Edmonds and no one else for company, that lady did not consider it right to offer a mere social engagement as an excuse for disappointing her. "It is not as though I really belonged to that part of the world," she said, smiling, to Marjorie. "You know, my dear, that it is only your fondness for having me with you that makes it important. I shall not be missed, nor thought about twice this evening, except by your dear self; and as Mrs. Stewart really seems to cling to me, I feel that I ought to stay. Don't you think so, dear?" "You have left nothing else for me to think," said Marjorie, trying to smile. She shrank to a degree that she did not herself understand from going to the Schuylers without her mother. Yet, as the idea seemed only absurd, she felt compelled to do as she would not, and in due course of time found herself journeying in Mr. Maxwell's company over the road which was so familiar to her, but which she had not traversed since that memorable November evening. If Mr. Maxwell remembered the same evening, which was probable, he made no sign, but kept his companion's thoughts on the book which they had just read, questioning and cross-questioning as to her knowledge of it so skilfully that Marjorie was compelled to put aside memories and nervousness altogether, and give undivided attention to the subject in hand, if she would not disgrace her reputation as a listener. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Making Fate by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. A Fateful Evening. They were late in arriving at the Schuyler farm, having been detained at the last moment by some tardily thought of plans for Mrs. Edmonds' comfort during their absence. Nearly all the other guests seemed to have been present for some time, and were in full tide of sociability. Prominent among them, quite a centre indeed, was Estelle Douglas, in new and exceedingly becoming spring attire, and with a glow on her cheeks and a sparkle in her eyes which indicated entire satisfaction with herself and her surroundings. She hovered not far away from Ralph Bramlett during the most of the evening, seeming to desire especially to make known the fact that she had a right to appropriate him. That young man was by no means at his best. He was more carefully dressed, perhaps, than he used to be, although he had always been careful of his personal appearance, but his $1,500 salary had enabled him to indulge in some expenditures in that direction from which economy had held him heretofore. His new suit was undoubtedly becoming, but his face was pale and unnaturally grave. His eyes had a look of unrest, and his manner to Estelle, had any one been closely observing them, would at times have suggested almost irritability. Marjorie would not be a close observer. Feeling sure that no good could result, at least at present, from their coming in contact with each other, she took pains to keep as far away from both Estelle and Ralph as she could, without attracting attention. If she had been thinking very much about herself, however, she would have discovered that so far from Ralph seconding her efforts in this direction, he was evidently anxious to be in her vicinity. If she found her way to the music room, he was sure to be there in a very few minutes. Did she join the promenaders in the large, old-fashioned hall, the second turn she made, Ralph was almost certain to be just behind her. When she sang, as she had promised her mother she would do, when invited, it was Ralph Bramlett who stood at her right, so close to Mr. Maxwell that it was with difficulty he turned her music. He said almost nothing, apparently, to anybody, and his face grew constantly moodier. Once Mr. Maxwell turned and looked at him for an instant, in utmost surprise. The occasion was when Estelle had asked him to join the groups on the piazza. "I don't wish to go on the piazza," he said. "Can you never feel willing to let a person do what he wants to for 5 seconds at a time?" The question and tone were so charged with irritability that it had been impossible for Mr. Maxwell not to turn to be sure of the speaker, nor had he kept the look of reproof entirely out of his eyes. Ralph saw him, and colored, and felt more annoyed and angry than before. But it was late in the evening when the incident occurred which brought to naught all Marjorie's efforts to avoid a direct conversation with her old friend. She was out, with many others, on the lawn, which was brilliantly and fantastically lighted with many Chinese lanterns. It formed a place of special attraction on this lovely May evening, which was almost as warm as an evening in midsummer. Marjorie and little Effie Schuyler had been taking a walk through the grounds, with Mr. Maxwell for their companion. There was a certain remarkable tree on the farther side of the house which Effie had been describing to Mr. Maxwell. He had asked her many questions concerning it, which she could not answer, and she had become very anxious to take him to see it. She had finally carried him off in triumph to see for himself how impossible it was for her to tell all the things about it that he had asked. Marjorie had taken a rustic seat under one of those charmingly lighted trees, and agreed to await their return. She had seen that wonderful tree many times, she affirmed, and knew no more about it than Effie did. If Mr. Maxwell could answer his own questions, simply by observing it once, he was the very person to give it attention. It was under the trees that Ralph Bramlett found her. He came upon her suddenly, from one of the paths that was in shadow, and it chanced that at that moment none of the many groups on the lawn were near her. The first that she knew of Ralph's approach was the sound of her name, Marjorie, spoken by the voice she knew so well, but there was a new note in it, a note of peremptoriness, irritability, almost of anger. No wonder that it startled her. She half arose, then sat down again. "Yes," she said gently. Her thought had always been to be as kind and cordial with Ralph as possible when it should suit his pleasure to allow her an opportunity. He gave her no time to consider what more she should say, but plunged at once into words. "I want to see you. I have been watching for an opportunity all the evening, and you have been watching to avoid me. How long is this farce to go on? Why do you treat me in this absurd way? Look back over the months and see if you can answer the question. It is inconceivable that you are utterly heartless, and I had never thought of you as a flirt. But how else am I to construe your treatment of me?" "Ralph!" she exclaimed, surprise and utter bewilderment in her voice. Was this the raving of a man who did not know what he was saying? It was so utterly unlike words which she had expected to hear from him. "What has occurred to excite you, to make it possible for you to feel that you can address such language to me?" "Oh, don't go on in that sort of way to me, Marjorie. I tell you I won't stand it. I have borne a great deal from you, but when you put on that air of soft surprise and pretend that you do not understand, it is more than flesh and blood can endure. I ask you how long you wish this farce that has been going on for months between us to be continued? It is utter folly for you to pretend ignorance of my meaning. You and I have known for years that we belong to each other, and that no person had a right to come between us. Explain, if you can, why you considered it necessary to suddenly build up a wall of separation between us, merely because my judgment in one single particular did not agree with yours, and I reserved the right, which any man of sense has, to use his own judgment when he is the responsible person. It is 6 months since we were here, Marjorie. Are not 6 months of misunderstanding and misery enough to atone to even you for not having had your own way in every particular?" The utmost feeling in Marjorie's mind for the moment was bewilderment. Was this man growing insane, or was she? 6 months of misunderstanding and misery. Yes, she understood so much. but the man to whom she had written a note so kind that even her mother feared lest it should be misunderstood, had returned her a reply which was almost insulting in its coldness, and had from that time discarded even her friendship. Not only this, but he was engaged to another, and yet he stood before her apparently upbraiding her for what had from the beginning been of his own planning. Certainly he must for the moment be out of his mind. How was she to reply? She looked at him out of great, troubled eyes, and allowed the startling query to pass through her mind. Could it be possible that he had been taking something stronger than the lemonades and chocolates which the Schuylers served? She dismissed the thought on the instant as unworthy of consideration, and answered him as she might have done a semi-lunatic. "Ralph, I have not the slightest conception of your meaning. You wrong me if you suppose that I have a hard thought in my heart concerning you. I have never at any time had the slightest desire to make 1 hour of your life miserable. On the contrary, my daily prayer is for your happiness in the life that you have chosen." He turned half away from her, as if in ungovernable impatience, even anger, as he said roughly, "Leave all that out. If you have nothing but prayers to offer me, I can get along without them. What I want to know is, do you dare to tell me that you do not understand that we were the same as engaged to each other?" The flush which had spread over Marjorie's face at the sound of her name from his lips had died quite away. She was very pale now, but quiet enough, much less excited than was he. "Ralph!" she said again, but there had come a change in her voice. There was an undertone of sternness. "I do not understand what possible good can result from speaking of those past days now. Whatever either of us may have thought in the past has nothing to do with the present. The basis upon which we may talk in the future is one, I hope, of friendliness and kindness. But I, at least, remember that I am speaking to a man who is engaged to Estelle Douglas." "Estelle Douglas be hanged!" he said hoarsely. "Don't fling her name at me now. You know perfectly well that you have yourself to thank for the wretched position in which I find myself. Had you not chosen to try to humiliate me by flirting openly and shamefacedly with that insufferable psalm-singing hypocrite whom you have let into your house, I should never have been overwhelmed with the embarrassments which now beset me. It will hardly do for you to fling my misery in my face when you have yourself to thank for it." Then indeed she arose, and the flash in her eyes was one of unmistakable indignation. "Mr. Bramlett," she said, in a tone such as he had never before heard from her, "you forget yourself utterly. You are disgracing yourself and insulting me. I am quite unable to understand what your object can be. I will try hard to think that some unexpected trouble has temporarily unsettled your mind. I know of no other explanation which could atone for what you have said to me. Let me pass, please." Then this young man of impulse felt himself suddenly impelled to an entire change of base. He caught at her arm as she would have passed him, and grasped her hand. "Marjorie, don't!" he said brokenly. "Don't go away. I don't know what I have said. I don't mean the half of it. I don't mean any of it, if you choose. Only, I can't lose you again. Oh, Marjorie, how could you let anything or any person come between us? Nothing shall." Bursting into sudden anger again, "I will have my rights. You belong to me. Estelle Douglas is less than nothing to me, and always was. I was insane or a fool when I allowed her to imagine otherwise. It was not for you to lay such a thing up against me. You know, and always have known, that you are the only person in the world to me. Let us end all this at once, Marjorie. Let us be married right away. I am in a position now to take care of you. Had I been 6 months ago, all this misery might have been saved us. Marjorie, there is nothing, there shall be nothing that can separate us again. Do not think about Estelle. She is a creature without depth. You have said so yourself many a time, and we both know it is true. She will forget me in a week. She has known for a dozen years that you and I belong to each other. Oh, Marjorie!" "Mr. Bramlett, I desire you to let me pass without another instant's delay. If you undertake to detain me, I shall call for assistance." And then Ralph Bramlett knew that he had passed beyond the bound of even his influence. Marjorie spoke in such a voice as he had not supposed she could use. He dropped his detaining hand suddenly, and took a single step aside. None too soon. She swept past him like a queen, just as Mr. Maxwell's voice was heard, still in merry chat with little Effie Schuyler. There was the slightest possible touch of surprise in his manner as he saw who was waiting near Marjorie, but he lifted his hat to him courteously, not apparently noticing that he received no sort of response, and turned to Marjorie. "Would you like to return to the house, Miss Edmonds, or shall we remain out longer?" "I would like to go in at once," said Marjorie, and he, too, noted the new ring in her voice. As Effie suddenly flitted away from them among the trees, she added, "Mr. Maxwell, I would like to go home if it is possible. Do you think I could get away without attracting too much notice?" "Certainly," he said quietly. "It is quite time that an affair of this kind was breaking up. I had designed consulting your wishes as soon as I had bestowed Miss Effie in a safe place. I am beginning to have qualms of conscience over my promises to your mother already." "Then let us get away at once," said Marjorie, with unnecessary energy. "I will be ready in a very few minutes. I will not return to the parlours at all. Mrs. Schuyler is in the dining room, I think. If you will come that way, we can go out by the dining room door." It was only too apparent that something had occurred to excite her painfully. The hand which Mr. Maxwell took to assist her up the steps trembled and was as cold as ice. But of course there was nothing which he could do, except to appear as blind as a bat and conduct himself as though nothing unusual had occurred. This he did to perfection, mentally berating himself the while for having left his charge, and yet in great mystification as to what could have occurred to so unnerve her. In a very short space of time they were on the road, and the late moon was making their way brilliant. Even the moon came to suggest the evening when they had travelled this way before. Selim was at his very best, so their progress was rapid. Mr. Maxwell, taking no notice of his companion's few words, spoken with evident effort, talked on, almost uninterruptedly. Discovering it to be difficult for her to respond, even in monosyllables, to his remarks, he took refuge in a long story of not too thrilling interest, which he knew, by being told in minutest detail, could be expected to occupy a good deal of the time. He told it in a way to require no questionings or comments. Some of it Marjorie heard, but the narrator did his work so well that during a portion of the time she could give herself up to the business of trying to get the control of her overwrought nerves. It was a difficult thing to accomplish. She felt a sense of great relief in the discovery at last that in a very few minutes she would be at home, and she could take refuge in the darkness of her own room. Meantime, what must her companion think of her? Being frank by nature, she resolved upon an attempt at explanation and apology. "Mr. Maxwell, you have been very kind to me tonight. I want you to know that I am grateful. I had a conversation with—" She hesitated for the right word and began again. "Something occurred this evening which made me feel incapable of conversation. You have seen it, of course, and have been thoughtful as usual. I thank you very much." He hardly knew how to reply to her without exhibiting too much sympathy, but after a moment's hesitation he said, "Consider me at all times, please, as a friend with whom you may talk or keep silence according to the mood of the hour. I am very well aware that we do not at all times feel like talking. Your mother has reached home before us and is at the window, I see. I am glad we have made such good time. She cannot have been long alone." Marjorie had fled to the solitude of her own room with a feeling of haste upon her, more than once during those 6 months, but never it seemed to her more eagerly than she did that night. A strange sense of humiliation possessed her, which made her shrink even from her mother's tender questionings. It was almost as though she had sat still and allowed herself and her mother's teachings, and the conscience and purity of them both, to be insulted. What had not that man said to her under cover of their dead past? Not content with tearing away all the sacred privacy which should gather about the relations with the woman whom he had asked to be his wife, he must even propose marriage to her. The man whom she had trained herself for weeks to look upon in the same light as one who had already taken marriage vows. What had his engagement meant to him then? What had their friendship been worth, ever, since he could even accuse her, the woman he was at that moment professing to love above all others, of the lowest and coarsest form of petty revenge known to womankind? Her cheeks burned in the darkness as she thought of it. Oh, the man must certainly be insane. She could almost hope, for the honor of his future, that he was. Yet her stern common sense coming to the rescue, assured her that he had known only too well what he was saying. He had been angry and determined, and had spoken out in the suddenness of his anger thoughts which must often have been in his mind. He did not love Estelle Douglas, did not even respect her enough not to speak such words of her as he had that night. And he had asked her to be his wife, and she was daily planning for the time when they two should be as one. What a monstrous thing it was! She felt a great pity for Estelle surging into her heart, and there met it that overwhelming sense of shame for herself. That he should take her to be such an one as that! That he should dare to talk to her about love! The pain and shame and burning indignation which she had kept under with resolute hand during that homeward ride, revenged themselves upon her at last in an outburst of more bitter tears than she had known she could shed. Nevertheless, she opened that communicating door before her mother was ready for rest, and went swiftly towards her, speaking rapidly. "Mother, let us close the house just as soon as we can, and go away. Let us be gone all summer, longer than that, forever if it were possible. I cannot stay here." Mrs. Edmonds turned and looked at her daughter in wonder and dismay. What had happened now? The girl's eyes were bright with the excitement which is not far removed from anger, yet she had been crying hard. Could Mr. Maxwell have said or done anything to disturb the careful self-control which she knew that Marjorie had been cultivating? "My dear, what is it?" she asked, putting both arms around her child and drawing her to the old childhood resting place, her face hidden on her mother's breast. The act brought the tears again for a few minutes, but she gave them little chance this time. "Mother," she said, raising her head, "forgive me, and do not be frightened. I ought not to disturb and distress you. So late as it is, too. Nothing very terrible has happened, that is, only, Mamma, I feel as if I must go away from here now, as though I could not breathe in the same town with them." She hid her face again, and the mother stood distressed and wondering. But presently the girl stood erect and finished her story, as much of it as she meant to tell. "Mother, I have lost my respect for him now, and when a girl has to say that, it is bitter." Then Mrs. Edmonds knew that her daughter had had an experience which she believed that loyalty to others would not allow her to tell, even to her mother. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Making Fate by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Everything has happened. What spell came over Ralph Bramlett to cause him to make so strange a blot as this upon his life, do you ask? Oh, who shall undertake to account for the doings of that young man? Yet, after all, it is in keeping with his general character. What was he but a creature at the mercy of every passing impulse? A creature of fate, as he persistently phrased it, never being able to understand that he made his own fate, was constantly making it out of materials which would have lent themselves as well to quite another style of manufacture. He had by no means gone to the Schuyler farm with the intention of rushing like a madman into temptation. It will be remembered, perhaps, that it was not his nature to act upon long-planned intentions. Once there, he had given himself up to the intoxication of Marjorie's presence. He had followed her from room to room, feasting his eyes upon her face, listening to the sound of her voice, getting, so far as was possible, every word that she uttered, using every means in his power to bring the spell of her old influence to bear upon him to its utmost, until he was wrought up to such a pitch of excitement that for the time being he completely lost control of himself. Of course, he was one who, never having trained himself to self-control, found this an easy matter. The longer he looked at Marjorie, and the more he listened to her words, the more hateful seemed the fate which he believed without any volition on his part had woven her meshes around him. He could not help speaking irritably to Estelle Douglas, almost savagely indeed, more than once, when there were not listeners, perhaps, as has been seen, when there were. In a certain sense she represented that baleful fate which had ruined his life. Why had she been always at hand when for any reason he was especially annoyed about Marjorie? Nay, he realized, and for one of his temperament it was an infinite pity that there was a degree of truth in it, that she had done what she could to prejudice him against his friend, and to make him feel that she had changed in her feelings toward him. It will perhaps have to be confessed that, creature of impulse though he was, and acting upon it all the while, there had been, through all the later months of his life, an undertone feeling that the present condition of things was not to last. This was not real life. It was simply a play in which the emotions were engaged, and he was a principal character. He was engaged to be married to Estelle Douglas. He had quarrelled with Marjorie. But somehow, before it should be forever too late, some one or something should interpose and set all these crooked relations right again. Fate could not be so cruel as to take Marjorie away from him entirely. Of course she belonged to him. Why, they had known it from their childhood. Everybody knew it. None better than Estelle Douglas. All this was not deliberate conviction. It was undertone, background. It was not allowed to influence his daily acts. He talked with Mr. Douglas and with Estelle, and with any person, indeed, who had a right to know of his affairs, quite as though his future was mapped out plainly before him. Yet the subtle background of hope, yes, even of expectation, was there all the time. When he sought Marjorie that evening on the lawn, and poured out his incoherent statements and preferred his half-insane charges, he was not acting in accordance with any preconceived plans, but simply following the impulse of the moment. Had he planned, he knew her well enough to be sure that he was using exactly the wrong words to influence her in the way that he desired. Indeed, almost as fast as the words were out of his mouth, he regretted their utterance. And as he saw Marjorie walking away with Mr. Maxwell, he called himself an insane fool. He was positively savage with Estelle Douglas on the journey home. "Do you remember the last time we were on this road together?" she asked him, for, either by accident or design, these two had not been together on that road since the dreary ride had been taken in the early morning through the November rain. Of course he did, he told her sharply. He had good reason to remember it. He had been a fool then about some matters, and had continued one ever since. This was suggestive, but ambiguous. Estelle did not know whether to meet it with indignation, or to pass it by as unworthy of notice. A remembrance of Ralph's present mood decided her on the latter course. It would hardly do to be indignant with a man whose own indignation had placed him beyond self-control. "What is the matter, Ralph?" she asked, and she tried to speak soothingly. "Something has happened. You do not act like yourself. Are there any business matters disturbing you? Tell me about them, please, and let me help you bear them. You know we ought to help each other in every way now." It was an unfortunate reminder. "Everything has happened," he said, and he spoke even more roughly than before. "You cannot help me, you can only—" He stopped just in time, having almost said in his folly and passion, "You can only hinder me." He changed it to, "What do you suppose you could do? There is no use in telling you anything about it. It is my confounded fate. Nothing that I wanted very much ever turned out as it ought to. I must have been born under an unlucky star." She decided then, poor girl, that it was affairs connected with his present business which had so disturbed him. There were days when he chafed bitterly under control, resenting the right of all the Snyders to "order him about as if he were a puppet," he told her. Some of his old dreams and ambitions connected with the law had probably come back to him this day. Some incident might have occurred to recall the hopes and dreams which he used to have of the future, and which she knew he had put aside, having decided to make his relations with Snyder & Co. as permanent as possible. Yet she could well understand that other plans, which had been central with him for so long, must sometimes push themselves forward in a mocking way to make him miserable. Was it fortunate or unfortunate that, coming as near to the truth as she did, she nevertheless missed it? The old hopes and dreams had undoubtedly been recalled in vividness that night, but they had naught to do with the law. Estelle had missed her attendant when he and Marjorie were on the lawn together, but she had also missed Mr. Maxwell, and believed him to be taking a promenade with Marjorie. Nothing had occurred to make her associate Ralph's wretched humour in any way with Marjorie. So, womanlike, she did what she could to comfort him. She could not know, how could she, that her very voice was irritating to him that night. She had too great faith in him, and in the words which he had spoken to her, to believe for a moment any such thing. Yet, despite all this, it must not be understood that Ralph Bramlett was a hopeless hypocrite. There were times when Estelle Douglas was able to comfort him. At these times he assured himself that she was more fitted to his needs than Marjorie ever could have been. There were days together when he succeeded in convincing himself that everything was as it should be, and that he and Estelle would get along nicely together. Of course, on such days, he expected to carry out all the pledges he had made to her and planned accordingly. Yet there was, all the time, that haunting little undertone, of which he was conscious, whispering that perhaps, some way, it would all turn out differently, even yet. Undoubtedly this is a contradiction. It must have been observed by students of human nature that these seeming and indeed actual contradictions are marked features of certain temperaments. Ralph Bramlett was fully determined to have his own way, and carry out his own plans without interference from any source, human or divine. At the same time, he was absolutely certain that he was not in the least to blame for the present condition of things, that he could not have ordered his life differently had he made ever so much effort, and that it was in short that mysterious imp which he had chosen to name Fate, who was responsible for all that concerned him. He left Estelle at her own door, with the coldest good night she had received from him since he had told her that she was the one chosen by him from all others, and went home angry with her and with all the world. He lay awake half the night, going over and over again the scenes which distressed and angered him, and bemoaning his miserable fate. Yet, before morning, his mood had changed. He called himself a consummate fool for his part of the proceedings, at the very moment when he took care to assure himself that had it not been for such and such circumstances beyond his control, he never would have done as he did. By daylight he said of Marjorie, "Well, let her go. She cares for no one but that fellow. Nothing is more evident. She even talks like him. It is just as well as it is. If he hadn't goaded me on by his insufferable assumption, I should never have thought of making the spectacle of myself which I did before her. Something for them to laugh over, I suppose, when it is described to him." And he ground his teeth in impotent rage at the idea. "If I had maintained my dignity and had nothing whatever to say to her, it would have been a great deal better. I believe I will write her a line of explanation. I can call it an apology, by way of courtesy, and tell her that I was disturbed yesterday about business matters, and ask her to excuse the ravings of a man who did not know what he was saying. No, I won't. I won't do anything of the kind. I will just let things take their own course. Something may come of it, after all, different from what I imagine. She may really not have supposed that I continued to care for her. Perhaps I shall even hear from her during the day, or the week. Who knows?" It will be observed that no less than 3 times in the course of this short interview with himself, he had entirely changed his view of the question, and that he understood Marjorie Edmonds as little as she had him. What may not be expected or feared of a man who is so reckless of his opinions upon all subjects that they can actually be swayed by the passing idle thoughts of the moment? It will be readily imagined that Mrs. Edmonds lost no time in acting upon Marjorie's sudden decision. She believed that it would be an excellent thing for her daughter to get away from home and its surroundings, for a time at least. She only very dimly imagined what might have occurred to rouse Marjorie in this way, but whatever it was, while feeling the deepest sympathy for her daughter, her prayer that night was one of thanksgiving. Surely it was better for Marjorie to know and realize the truth, and if it had been proved to her that Ralph Bramlett was unworthy of even her friendship, the mother knew her daughter well enough to understand that she was saved. Before evening of the following day, sundry plans for the summer had been discussed, not only between themselves, but with Mr. Maxwell. That gentleman urged them strongly to select his own college town as their summer resort, advocating its climate and surroundings with great confidence. "To be sure, I am not to be there myself," he said, "which I assure you I regret. It would give me great pleasure to show you around the beautiful old place, and exhibit its numerous historic lions to you. But I am unselfish enough to want you to enjoy it, even though I cannot share the pleasure with you. I know of no other spot which can boast so many of the advantages and so few of the drawbacks of a summer home. Miss Edmonds would be simply charmed with the country about there, and the views which she could sketch would be unlike any which she has in her portfolios at present." Over this last Marjorie laughed and blushed a little. She had not known that he was so familiar with her sketches from nature. She had come to have a poor opinion of her work in that direction, since she had seen with what a free, strong hand he reproduced on paper the choice places he visited. It was perhaps because she was indifferent as to where they went, and also because Mr. Maxwell could assist so materially in arranging the details for this one place, that it was finally chosen. "We will go there for a time at least," decided Mrs. Edmonds, "and if we find that Mr. Maxwell has looked upon this favourite spot through prejudiced spectacles, why, we can change our plans and go elsewhere. We will leave ourselves untrammelled by any ideas of stability, and, for this one summer, will feel as free to rove as the gypsies themselves." She laughed a little as she spoke, and cast a swift, questioning glance at Mr. Maxwell. How much or how little did that gentleman understand of her reasons for action? She could not but be grateful for the gracious and skilful way in which he aided and abetted all her plans. Was he thoughtful for her, just as he was for all man and womankind? Or was he— But here the mother resolutely stopped her questionings. It was while Ralph Bramlett, who was being kept very busy, was wondering what would happen next, and trying to decide just how he should conduct himself if he should meet Marjorie, as he was liable to, of course, on any day, that Estelle waylaid him one evening as he was passing the door in haste with her budget of news. "Ralph, did you know that Mrs. Edmonds and Marjorie were going away for the summer? They are going to close their house. Nearly everything is in readiness. It seems that Mr. Maxwell has changed his plans and is going to start earlier than he had intended. And what do you think? Marjorie and her mother are going with him. That is, they are going to his old home to spend the summer. I wonder they do not go abroad with him. Marjorie cannot apparently endure the thought of being entirely separated from him, so she is going to his old haunts to rove around alone among them, I suppose, while he is away in Europe enjoying himself. Isn't that infatuation, Ralph? Isn't it queer in Marjorie? It seems so unlike her some way. I never thought she had much of the sentimental in her disposition when you and she were so intimate. Did you?" "It is of very little consequence what I thought," said Ralph, "and I am sure it is of equally little consequence where other people spend their summers, or their lives for that matter. I am unable to account for your exceeding interest in the movements of the Edmonds family. Suppose we dismiss them from our topics of conversation in the future." "Oh, well," said Estelle, "I won't talk about them if you are so particular. Marjorie and I have always been friends, and I thought you would like to hear the news, especially as you and she used to be so fond of each other." "That, my dear, is another point which I am weary of hearing harped upon. Can't you let past things alone?" She pouted a little and told him he was cross, and she believed he always was when she said anything about Marjorie, and she didn't understand it. Then he said he was in haste and could not discuss even such important questions with her at present, and he laughed a little and tried to pass it all off as a joke, adding that he would try to call later in the evening, or, if business detained him, certainly tomorrow evening, when they would have affairs of vastly more importance to consider. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30, the final chapter of Making Fate by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30, Talking It Over. On the following Tuesday morning, Ralph Bramlett looked out of the window of his office in the distillery and watched the train whiz by, which he knew was bearing Marjorie Edmonds away with Mr. Maxwell for her escort. Oh, the mother was there, of course, but he ignored her. He had told himself for weeks that he hated her. She seemed to him a part of that relentless fate which had pursued him. He told himself now that Marjorie was gone at last out of his life, and this time he meant it. There was a dull pain in his heart which made him understand that that subtle undertone of hope which had been all along telling him that somehow, out of all this obstinacy and misunderstanding and miscalculation would evolve that which he desired, had proved treacherous and left him. That rose-colored future which had held itself before him for so many years had disappeared, and only dull prose filled its place. He was Bramlett, bookkeeper in a distillery, and under engagement of marriage with Estelle Douglas. "Well," he said, throwing down his fountain pen with an angry frown, as, having been held point downward while he considered, it proceeded to conduct itself after the manner of those interesting instruments, and let fall a great black tear on his account-book. "Let her go. Let everything go. Fate has done all the evil that she can for me. Now I'll see what I can do. I'll be a rich man anyway. I'll show her one of these days what she has lost by nursing her obstinacy and ill humour until she has ruined everything." His pronouns were confused, but he well understood that the second one meant Marjorie Edmonds and not fate. "I may not be a judge," he continued, in communion with his worst self, "and I may not be able to have anything else that I had planned, but I will see to it that I am not circumvented here. If I am not a millionaire before I am 25 years older, then the world may set me down for a fool. I see my way to so much at least, and it is not a very small thing after all, as this world goes. The time was when we used to talk sentimentalism together, and assure ourselves that we did not care for money. It was honor we meant to seek. Fool! As if she did not like money better than the most of them. What else attracted her to that whining hypocrite? Estelle is more honest at least. She frankly owns that she is fond of it. Well, she shall have it. She and I will do very well together. She will know how to spend my money in a way to do me honor. If I only knew some way to convince that girl that she had not broken my heart. After all, it is that which hurts most, I believe. The thought of those two talking it over, and laughing together about the spectacle which I made of myself that night. What evil spirit possessed me? I might have known that it would come to worse than nothing. If I had only kept away from the Schuyler farm altogether, nothing of the sort would have happened. I believe the place is bewitched. There has been nothing for me but ill luck in every direction since I went there before, and I shouldn't have gone this time if Estelle had not almost forced me to do so. That girl must learn to mind her own business better than she knows how to do now. Once married, I think it will not be difficult to show her that I intend to be master in my own house. I'll be even with that Maxwell yet, in some way. He has ruined my life, but he shall not gloat over it always. Talk about justice! There is no such thing in the world. The paths of some people are spread with roses, no matter what they do, how dishonorable they are, or false, everywhere they turn is sunshine. Look at Marjorie Edmonds. Where could one find a specimen more false than she has been? And she deceived me utterly. I thought she would endure anything from me. Probably she intended to deceive me all the time. I have no doubt but that they planned it together. And their lives must be crowned. Everything just as they wish and plan. While for others, a relentless fate as cruel as death dogs their track, overthrowing their most cherished hopes, and bringing their best efforts to naught. What have I done but the best I could all my life? And what have I had but reproach and misfortune and misery in return? Especially since I took what people call the right road and joined the church. I wish I had not done that at least. If it had not been for Glyde Douglas, I should never have thought of such a thing. I believe that entire Douglas family have been selected to be my evil geniuses. Oh well, that is only a sham with the rest. Money is the only real success. From this time forth I am going in for success. Yet the sentence ended with a groan almost of despair, and the poor, self-haunted, self-destroyed young man suddenly bowed his head on the great ledger spread open before him, and his strong, young frame shook with the pain that filled his soul. Even when he talked with himself he was not quite true. That is, there was really another and better self which it was becoming the habit of his life to ignore. It was weeks before Marjorie Edmonds mentioned his name. Then, one afternoon, she began suddenly to talk about him, telling that early and only confidant of hers, the patient mother, some things which she had decided that she ought to know. It was a lovely summer day, and they were sitting together under one of the grand old trees which Mr. Maxwell had described to them. Marjorie had just sketched it, and her mother was criticizing it, when the daughter began. "Mother, you have been as good as gold to me as usual. I don't suppose I can ever tell you how grateful I have been for all your patience with me, but I feel it all the same. There is a favor I want to ask of you, but before that I ought to tell you something. That night, you know, when we went to the party at Schuyler's, Ralph came out to me on the lawn and said some words which I will not repeat, not even to you, because I want you to think that he did not mean a great many of them. He was wild with excitement. However, he said enough to make me understand something of what you have felt about him, and have tried to have me see. I think you are right in part, mother. He could never have had the character which I thought he had. But never mind now, all that is past. You will understand, mother dear, why I do not speak any plainer. Of course, you are sure now that everything is as utterly past between us two as though one of us had died. But that does not hinder me from wanting to help him. From words which he spoke to me that night, I feel sure that there is misery in store for him and for Estelle, not because of me, but because Mother, he does not have right views of anything. I do not understand it. I have thought over what he said, and wondered how it was possible for a Christian, even in the excitement of anger, to speak such words. I tremble for them, mother, and my heart aches with the longing to keep them from wrecking their lives. Said Mrs. Edmunds, speaking slowly, choosing her words with utmost care, so that her daughter might feel that they were spoken from conviction and not from prejudice. Do you feel sure, Marjorie, that he knows what it is to be a Christian? Has he impressed you at any time as a man who was acquainted and in daily fellowship with Jesus Christ? I am afraid, dear, and have been from the first, that uniting with the church was one of the accidents or impulses of his life, rather than a deliberate public avowal of an inward change. I do not necessarily mean by that he intended to deceive, but rather that he was himself deceived. I am afraid he thinks that religion consists in joining the church and attending the communion when it is convenient, and a few outward acts of that sort. She did not know whether or not Marjorie would be shocked by such plain speaking, but the girl made no sign that she had even heard. She sat with one hand shading her eyes, and the sunlight glinting through the trees shimmered around her, making a beautiful picture for the mother's eyes to rest upon. But there was a pain in it for her. Was this sweet young life to be always shadowed by that baleful one which she who had been called of God to shield and train her child, had permitted to be so closely connected with it? After a few minutes of silence, she asked gently, "What was the favor, daughter, that was to be asked of me?" "Mother," said Marjorie, dropping her hand and turning toward her, "I am afraid you are right. I am afraid that Ralph Bramlett has no personal acquaintance with Jesus Christ, has not even sought it. And he is a member of the church. I have heard it said that people who unite with the church under mistaken ideas, without having really given themselves over into Christ's keeping, are so hard to reach." Silence again for a few minutes, then, "Mother, I am sure you do not understand me. If Ralph could if it were possible for him to be honorably released from Estelle Douglas to-morrow, he could never, never be anything to me. All that is utterly and forever past. When one actually loses one's respect for and faith in a person, why then— But the favor I wanted to ask is this. You used to like Ralph, mamma, and you have been good to him, and tried, in a great many ways, to help him. Let a little bit of that old liking, or old pity, if you will, creep into your heart for him again, enough so that you can pray for him with all your soul. Mother, will you join me in a union of prayer for Ralph and Estelle, that God will not let go of either of them? That he will in some way, by some path that we do not understand, nor even see to be possible, lead them to himself. For I am persuaded that Estelle knows no more about this matter than he does, and they will both have ruined lives. Can you join me in this, dear mother?" Mrs. Edmund's manner was very tender and serious. "Daughter," she said, "I want you to feel how entirely my heart goes out with you in this desire, and how fully I will join with you in a covenant of prayer. Yet there is one thing which I feel that I must say to you. Do you remember, dear, that even God cannot force people to yield their wills to Him? He has chosen to limit Himself in order to make us free to become all that grace can make us, instead of being mere machines. It is He who cried, "Ye will not come unto me, that ye might have life." I do not know Estelle Douglas very well, but I have studied Ralph for years. What is in his way is his own undisciplined will, and he does not call it by that name. He says fate. Do you remember how often the words used to be on his boyish lips? That is just my fate, when really what he was bemoaning had nearly always to do with some impulsive folly of his own? I did not think so much of it then, though I remember I talked with him more than once about it, but I have seen since that he is always pursued by the idea that a something outside of himself, and with which he has nothing to do, makes his misfortunes for him, and oversets plans which were wise and ought to have prospered. He still names it fate, I think, and not self. Now, dear, I wanted to say thus much to you, lest you might think that God could save Ralph in spite of himself, and grow to feeling, perhaps, if you were disappointed after long waiting, that he was almost cruel. I have known people who did not understand God any better than that. But we will pray, and never let go our hold while we live. That is our part, and we will be sure that He who so loved that He gave His Son will do His part. Mr. Maxwell had been abroad for 5 weeks. There had come from him 2 letters, addressed to Mrs. Margaret Edmonds, but inside they commenced "Dear Friends." Delightful letters they were. It was almost as good, Mrs. Edmonds said, as having a trip abroad one's self, with all the discomforts left out. The week following this talk with her daughter, the mother, who was his sole correspondent from that family, wrote this: "My daughter wishes me to ask a favor of you. She has been studying lately, with deepest interest, the verse, 'Where 2 of you shall agree,' etc., and kindred passages, and has become impressed as never before with the power which lies in a union of prayer. She wishes me to ask you to join with her mother and herself in a covenant of prayer for the young man, Ralph Bramlett, and his betrothed wife, Estelle Douglas. We have occasion to fear that neither of these know what it is to have the Lord Jesus Christ for a personal Saviour, and to try to follow Him in their daily lives. Marjorie, through a certain experience of hers, which loyalty to her sense of honour keeps her from fully revealing even to me, has come to believe that the young man especially is in danger, and that unless some strong hand interposes, there will be the moral shipwreck of 2 lives. She bids me say that there are a few people, whom, it seems to her, God has taught in a peculiar sense how to pray, and you impress her as one of these. Therefore she desires to lay this burden upon your conscience. We know, without awaiting your reply, what it will be, for by the same token that we know He has taught you to pray, we are sure He has given you a heart to respond to all such calls as these." It was a dreary, rainy evening when Mr. Maxwell read and re-read this letter. He had felt more alone that day than he was wont to feel. In fact, he knew that during all the days there was a curious sense of homesickness upon him, such as, in his many trips abroad, he had never felt before. He had turned over his pile of home letters eagerly, sought out the one which he recognized as from Mrs. Edmonds, and pushing the rest aside, had given himself entirely to its influence. Evidently it in some degree met and ministered to the homesick feeling at his heart. Especially had he read several times with deepest interest the paragraph commencing, "My daughter wishes me to ask a favor of you." He was conscious as he read it that there was a quickening of his pulses, and an eagerness to know anything which this daughter could desire. Was there anything that she could ask which he would not be willing to give? Yet the petition had a strange effect upon him. He dropped the letter at last, and began to pace up and down his small room. "The unmitigated scoundrel!" he said aloud, and with suppressed force in his tones. "And she is giving her life to prayer for him!" Back and forth he paced, feeling the place too small for him. He stepped to the window and pushed it up to its utmost height. He wished himself out in the rain and the darkness. "God forgive me," he said at last. "Can I pray for him with all my heart? Can I forgive him for the mischief he has wrought?" He sat down presently, and leaning his elbows on his little writing table, covered his face with both hands. There was need for heart searching. Was there really that in his heart which prevented him from crying to God for a soul in peril? He got down on his knees at last, and prayed like one who had indeed been taught how, even by the Holy Spirit. But at that time his prayer was chiefly for himself. There went out by the next morning's American mail, addressed to Mrs. Margaret Edmonds, a very brief letter, which ran as follows: "My very dear friend, there is no time to write a letter by this mail. I only take a moment to say, in reply to your and your daughter's request, Amen with all my soul. God bless you and her. Leonard Maxwell." So this was the way in which they "talked over" together Ralph Bramlett's affairs. End of chapter 30. End of Making Fate by Pansy. Recording by TriciaG. Thanks for listening.